The sun hung low in the Arizona sky, painting the desert in shades of amber and gold. The light caught on the beads of sweat running down Amara Swift Arrow's face as she ran through the scrubland, her breath coming in sharp, painful gasps. Her bare feet, bleeding and blistered, found little purchase on the rocky ground. Behind her, the sound of hoofbeats grew louder. Three riders gaining. Her lungs burned with each breath, and the torn edges of her dress snagged on the brush. She had been running since dawn when they had first caught sight of her near the creek. Hours of pursuit had left her legs trembling, her vision blurring at the edges. Still she ran. The land sloped downward, and through the haze of exhaustion, Amara saw a glimmer of water, a stream cutting through the harsh landscape. Hope surged within her for just a moment, quickly replaced by despair as she realized the water offered no escape, only a moment's respite before they caught her. The hoofbeats were so close now she could hear the horses snorting with exertion. A whoop of triumph echoed across the canyon. "Nowhere to run now, Apache!" Amara stumbled into the shallow stream, the cool water a brief shock against her skin. She whirled to face her pursuers, back pressed against a large boulder, eyes darting desperately for some escape. Three men on horseback emerged from the tree line, their faces flushed with exertion, and something darker, the thrill of the hunt. The one in front, with a red kerchief around his neck and a twisted smile, slid from his saddle. Victor Sullivan, known to most as Red Wolf. His reputation extended throughout the territory as a man who took pleasure in cruelty. "Well, well," he drawled, stepping into the water. "Looks like our little bird got her feathers wet." The other two men laughed, dismounting to join their leader. One was tall and gaunt with yellowed teeth, the other stocky with a beard that couldn't hide the youth in his face. Both carried the same cruel anticipation in their eyes. "Please," Amara said, hating the tremor in her voice. "I have done nothing to you." "Nothing?" Red Wolf's voice hardened. "Your kind took everything from me, my mother, my childhood." He splashed closer, his boots kicking up water that sparkled in the evening light. "And you think you can just wander through our lands?" "I am only passing through," she said, her back pressing harder against the rock, "to find my sister's children." Red Wolf's laugh had no humor in it. "Hear that, boys? She's looking for family." He reached out, fingering the beaded necklace at her throat. "This looks valuable. Apache craft, isn't it? Bet it would fetch a good price in town." With a sudden jerk, he tore the necklace from her neck, the beads scattering into the water like drops of blood. Amara lunged forward instinctively, her hand reaching for the precious heirloom, her mother's last gift before the massacre. "No," she cried. The backhand came swift and hard, sending her sprawling into the shallow water. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs, and for a moment, the world spun in a kaleidoscope of pain and sunlight reflected off the water's surface. "Now look what you made me do," Red Wolf said, his voice a mockery of regret. "Got your dress all wet." His companion sniggered, moving closer. The stocky one pulled at her sleeve. "Might as well take it off then, so it can dry," he suggested, his young voice cracking with excitement. Amara tried to pull away, but strong hands gripped about her arms, tearing at the already damaged fabric of her dress. She fought wildly, her dignity forgotten in the desperate need to escape. But it was 3 against 1. Her head snapped back as Red Wolf grabbed her braid, yanking her upright. "Maybe we should teach her what happens to Apache women who trespass," he whispered, his breath hot against her ear. Jed Rollins crouched in the shadows of a juniper tree, listening to the distant sounds carried on the evening breeze. He had been mending fences along the western edge of his property when he'd first heard the commotion. Horses moving fast, voices calling. Instinct born from years as an Army scout had sent him moving quietly through the brush, his Winchester rifle held ready. His right leg ached as he moved. An old wound that never healed right after a Comanche arrow had found its mark 8 years earlier. The constant pain was a reminder of another life, one filled with blood and regret. These days, Jed kept to himself on the small ranch he'd built after the war, after everything else was taken from him. The voices grew clearer as he approached the stream that marked his property line. The water rights had been one of the few things he'd insisted on when purchasing the land. Water meant life out here, and Jed had seen too much death. Through the branches, he caught sight of them. 3 men surrounding a woman in the shallow water. Even at this distance, Jed recognized Red Wolf Sullivan. The man had a reputation that stretched from Tucson to the border, most of it involving liquor, violence, and a particular hatred for anyone with Apache blood. Jed's jaw tightened as he saw the woman's torn dress, the way she fought against their grip. Her long black hair hung in a tangled braid, and though her face was turned away, the set of her shoulders spoke of both fear and defiance. He'd seen enough. With practiced care, Jed raised the Winchester to his shoulder. He didn't aim at the men, not yet, but at a large rock jutting from the water about 10 feet to their right. The rifle's report cracked through the evening stillness like thunder, sending splinters of stone flying. The men froze, then scattered like startled birds, reaching for weapons as they sought cover. "Next one won't miss," Jed called, his voice carrying clear across the water. "And I can put 6 more rounds in you before you figure out where I'm shooting from." A tense silence followed. The woman remained where she was, half crouched in the stream, her eyes scanning the trees for her unexpected savior. "Rollins?" Red Wolf called out, recognizing the voice. "This ain't your business." "You're on my land," Jed replied evenly. "That makes it my business." He shifted his position silently, moving to a new vantage point before continuing. "Now you boys have a choice. Ride out, or I start making widows." There was muttered consultation among the 3 men. Jed could see the calculation in Red Wolf's eyes, trying to determine if the threat was real, if it was worth dying over an afternoon's cruel entertainment. "This ain't over, Rollins," Red Wolf finally spat, gathering the reins of his horse. "The Apache bitch isn't worth dying for, but don't think I'll forget this." "I'm counting on you remembering," Jed replied, still hidden among the trees. "Now go." With venomous glares and muttered curses, the 3 mounted their horses. Red Wolf lingered a moment longer, staring in the direction of Jed's voice. "Your days of being the big hero are long gone, Rollins," he called. "Times are changing." Then they were gone, hoofbeats fading into the distance, leaving only the gentle sound of the stream and the ragged breathing of the woman still standing in the water. Jed waited a full minute to ensure they weren't doubling back before emerging from his hiding place. He approached slowly, rifle lowered but still ready. The woman watched him warily, gathering the torn remnants of her dress around herself with as much dignity as she could muster. Up close, Jed could see the bruise forming on her cheek where Red Wolf had struck her, the scratches on her arms and legs from running through the brush. Her dark eyes were filled with exhaustion and fear. But there was something else there too, a fierce intelligence that assessed him even as he assessed her. "You hurt bad?" he asked gruffly, stopping at the edge of the stream. She didn't answer, her gaze flicking between his face and the rifle in his hands. Jed sighed, slinging the weapon over his shoulder in a gesture meant to reassure. "I'm not with them. Name's Jedediah Rollins. Most call me Jed. This is my land you're standing on." The woman took a small step backward, water swirling around her ankles. "They stole my necklace," she said, her English accented but clear, "and tore my dress." Jed nodded, noting the practical way she stated these facts. No self-pity, just an accounting of wrongs done. He respected that. "Can't help with the necklace," he said, shrugging out of his worn canvas coat. "But you can use this." He held the coat out, taking care not to move too quickly. The woman eyed it suspiciously, then him, clearly weighing her options. After a long moment, she waded forward and took the garment, turning her back to pull it on over her torn dress. The coat engulfed her smaller frame, but it covered the worst of the damage. When she turned back to face him, some small measure of dignity had been restored. "Thank you," she said, the words stiff, as if rarely used. Jed nodded once. "You got somewhere to go?" he asked. The woman's gaze drifted eastward, toward the mountains that loomed purple in the distance. "I was traveling to Fort Apache," she said, "to find what remains of my sister's family." Jed's expression didn't change, but something inside him went very still. Fort Apache, the site of some of the worst atrocities he'd witnessed during his time as a scout, the place where he'd made a choice that had cost him everything. "That's 30 miles yet," he said, "and Red Wolf and his boys will be looking for you." The woman's chin lifted slightly. "I will manage." Jed took in the cuts on her feet, the exhaustion evident in the way she swayed slightly where she stood. Night would fall soon, and the desert got cold quickly after dark. She wouldn't make it 5 miles, let alone 30. My ranch is about a mile west, he said, gesturing with his head. You can clean up there, rest till morning. I'll loan you a horse tomorrow. Suspicion darkened her eyes. Why would you help me? It was a fair question. In these parts, an Apache woman alone could expect little kindness from white settlers. Because I've seen what men like Red Wolf do when there's no one watching, Jed said simply. And I've done enough watching in my life. The woman studied him for a long moment, her gaze seeming to pierce through him, searching for deceit. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, for she gave a small nod. I am called Amara, she said. Amara Swift Arrow. Jed, he replied, though he had already told her his name. Old habits of proper introduction died hard. Can you walk? Amara took a tentative step, then winced as her foot found a sharp stone. Without waiting for permission, Jed moved forward and offered his arm for support. She hesitated only briefly before accepting it, her grip firm despite her exhaustion. They made slow progress through the gathering twilight, Jed matching his pace to hers, trying not to favor his bad leg too obviously. Neither spoke as they walked, each lost in private thoughts, connected only by necessity in the shared rhythm of their footsteps across the dusty ground. Jed's ranch was modest, but well kept. A small cabin of rough-hewn logs stood beside a barn just large enough for 4 horses. A corral extended from one side, currently empty, as the horses grazed in the small pasture beyond. A vegetable garden, fenced against rabbits and deer, grew alongside the cabin, and a woodpile stood neatly stacked against the barn. It was the home of a solitary man who kept busy to avoid thinking too much. As they approached, Amara's steps slowed, weariness returning to her posture. The cabin represented safety, but also confinement, a white man's domain where she would be at his mercy. Stove's inside, Jed said, sensing her hesitation. Got water in the rain barrel round back if you want to wash up first. He led her to the back of the cabin where a large wooden barrel collected rainwater from the roof's gutters. Beside it sat a metal basin and a sliver of soap. With deliberate care, Jed filled the basin halfway, then stepped back, giving her space. I'll be inside getting supper started, he said. Take your time. Amara waited until the cabin door closed behind him before approaching the basin. The water was cool and clear, a precious resource in this arid land. She removed Jed's coat and her torn dress, using the soap to wash away the dust and sweat of her long day's flight. The cuts and bruises on her body stung under her careful ministrations, but the pain was clarifying, keeping her alert. She didn't trust this white man and his unexpected kindness. In her 26 years, Amara had learned that kindness from white men often came with a price she wasn't willing to pay. Yet something about Jed Rollins' manner gave her pause. There was a weariness in him, a sadness that spoke of loss, and in his eyes she had seen not pity or disdain, but a simple recognition. One survivor acknowledging another. After washing, Amara examined her dress. The fabric was torn at the shoulder and across the bodice, impossible to wear with any dignity. Reluctantly, she put Jed's coat back on, buttoning it closed. The sleeves hung past her fingers, and she rolled them back until her hands were free. When she entered the cabin, she found Jed at the small iron stove, stirring something in a pot. The interior was spare but tidy. A table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed against one wall, shelves holding a few books and essential supplies. A rifle rack above the door held 2 more weapons besides the Winchester he'd used earlier. What caught Amara's attention, however, were the small touches that spoke of a life beyond solitude. A child's carved wooden horse on the shelf, a faded quilt on the bed that had clearly been made by a woman's hands, and, most surprisingly, 2 small empty beds built into a corner alcove, as if waiting for children who never arrived. Jed glanced up as she entered, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. Food's almost ready, he said. Nothing fancy, just beans and bacon. Got some cornbread left from yesterday. Amara nodded, remaining near the door, unsure of her place in the stranger's home. Her eyes drifted to a small frame on the wall, a tintype photograph of a woman with 2 small children, a boy and a girl, all smiling into the camera with solemn joy. Following her by Jed's face tightened almost imperceptibly. My wife Eleanor, he said gruffly, and our children, Sam and Lily. The past tense told Amara all she needed to know. I am sorry for your loss, she said formally. Jed didn't respond, turning back to the stove with careful focus. After a moment, he gestured to the table. Sit, if you want. Amar moved cautiously to the table, choosing the chair that allowed her to keep both Jed and the door in view. Her feet, now clean but still cut, throbbed with each heartbeat. The day's exertions were catching up with her, and it took all her remaining strength to maintain her alert posture. Jed brought 2 tin plates to the table, each holding a portion of beans with pieces of bacon mixed in. A chunk of cornbread sat beside each portion. He set one plate before her, then took his own seat across the table. Without ceremony, he began to eat, not watching to see if she would do the same. Hunger won out over caution. Amara ate slowly at first, then with increasing urgency as her body demanded sustenance. The food was simple but filling, and Jed refilled her plate without comment when she finished. As the edge of hunger dulled, exhaustion swept through Amara like a wave. Her eyelids grew heavy, and it became increasingly difficult to keep her back straight, her senses alert. Jed noticed. Without a word, he rose and went to the narrow bed, stripping off the quilt and a blanket. These he carried to a spot near the stove, where he arranged them into a makeshift bed on the floor. You can sleep here, he said, straightening. It's warm by the stove. I'll take the chair. Amara frowned, confusion momentarily overriding her fatigue. Your bed wouldn't be proper, Jed cut her off, his tone suggesting the matter was settled. Besides, I don't sleep much these days. There was something in his voice, a shadow of old pain, perhaps, that resonated with Amara's own experience. Sleep had been her enemy, too, filled with memories she couldn't escape. Thank you, she said simply, moving to the blankets. Jed nodded, turning to bank the fire in the stove for the night. Amara lay down, still wearing his coat, positioning herself so she could see both Jed and the door. Despite her wariness, the warmth from the stove and the day's exhaustion conspired against her. Within minutes, she was asleep, her body surrendering to what her mind would not. Jed sat in the wooden chair by the table, a cup of coffee growing cold beside him, his Winchester rifle across his knees. In the dim light of the single oil lamp, he watched the steady rise and fall of Amara's breathing beneath the blanket. He hadn't planned on taking in a stray today, especially not one as complicated as an Apache woman running from Red Wolf Sullivan, heading to Fort Apache. It was as if the past he'd been running from for years had suddenly materialized on his doorstep, wrapped in his own coat. His bad leg ached more than usual after the long ride. Jed shifted in his chair, seeking a position that might ease the familiar pain. Nothing except memories. His gaze drifted to the photograph on the wall. Eleanor with her gentle smile, little Sam proudly standing straight, 5 years old and convinced he was a man already, and Lily, just 3, her chubby hand clutching her mother's skirt, dark curls framing a face so like Eleanor's that it sometimes hurt to look at her. All gone now, taken by the fever that had swept through the territory 3 years ago. 3 fresh graves dug in the hard earth behind the cabin, each one taking a piece of Jed with it until he wasn't sure what remained of the man he'd once been. He'd failed them, been away when the fever struck, scouting for the army one last time. By the time he returned, it was too late. Too late for everything except regret. With a quiet sigh, Jed reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch. From it, he carefully removed a piece of paper, unfolding it with practiced movements. In the faint lamplight, Eleanor's handwriting seemed to glow, her last letter to him, written as the fever took hold. My dearest Jedediah, the children ask for you daily, and I tell them their brave father will return soon. I pray this finds you well, and that God speeds you home to us. The fever came sudden. First Sam complained of headache, then Lily grew hot to the touch. Now I feel it in my bones as well. Doc Jenkins has been by, but says there's little to be done except wait and pray. Many in town have already been taken. If God wills that I should join them, know that my last thoughts were of you and of the Barna you brought to my life. You have been a good husband and father, Jedediah Rollins, despite the burdens you carry. I release you from your promise. Find peace, my love. Forgive yourself for what happened at the fort. God has already forgiven you, as have I. With eternal love, Eleanor. Jed carefully refolded the letter along its well-worn creases. Eleanor's absolution had not been enough. How could it be when she never knew the full truth of what he'd done, what kind of man he really was? A small sound drew his attention back to Amara. She had shifted in her sleep, one hand clenched into a fist, her brow furrowed as if in pain. A nightmare, perhaps. Jed knew about those all too well. As he watched, something slipped from the pocket of his coat that she still wore, a small object that landed softly on the floor beside her makeshift bed. In the dim light, Jed couldn't make out what it was. Curiosity and caution warred within him. Carefully moving with the silence that had once made him the Army's best scout, Jed set aside his rifle and crossed to where Amara slept. The object was a small leather pouch, similar to the one that held Eleanor's letter. It had fallen open, revealing a folded piece of buckskin within. Blood Oath Part 2, Revelation and Alliance. Jed hesitated, aware he was violating Amara's privacy, but suspicion won out. He needed to know more about this woman he'd brought into his home. Gently, he extracted the piece of buckskin and unfolded it. In the faint light, he could just make out markings burned into the hide, symbols he recognized as Apache writing, and in the center a name written in English letters, Jedediah Rollins. A cold weight settled in Jed's stomach as he stared at his own name on this strange talisman. Why would Amara carry such a thing? What did it mean? Before he could think further, Amara's eyes snapped open. For a moment, she seemed disoriented, her gaze unfocused. Then she saw the buckskin in Jed's hands, and all traces of sleep vanished from her expression, replaced by a mixture of alarm and fury. She sat up quickly, reaching for the hide. "Give that back," she demanded, her voice low and intense. Jed held it just beyond her reach, his own expression hardening. "Why do you have my name on this?" he asked. "What is this?" Amara's eyes darted to the rifle he'd left by the chair, then back to his face. Calculation and fear warred in her expression. "It is nothing," she said, her voice too controlled to be believable. "A remembrance only." "A remembrance of what?" Jed pressed, not backing down. "We've never met before today." For a long moment, Amara was silent, her breathing quickening. Then with evident reluctance, she spoke. "It is a blood oath, a promise to find the men responsible for the death of my family." Jed felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath him. "Your family," he repeated, the words coming slow and thick. "At Fort Apache," Amara continued, watching him closely now. "5 years ago, the soldiers came at dawn. They killed everyone they found. My mother, my father, my husband, and our newborn son." Her voice caught, but she mastered it quickly. "My sister and I escaped only because we were gathering wood in the forest." The memories Jed had spent years trying to drown in work and whiskey rose up before him. Screams cutting through the dawn mist, the smell of gunpowder and blood, his own voice shouting commands that went unheeded as the situation spiraled beyond control. "And you think I was responsible," he said flatly. Amara's chin lifted. "I know you were there. A scout named Rollins. The soldiers called you Ghost because you moved without sound. You led them to our village." Jed's hand tightened around the buckskin talisman. She wasn't wrong. He had been the scout for that patrol, had found the small settlement of Apache who had left the reservation. "But what happened after?" "I didn't know what they planned," he said, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "I was just doing my job." "Your job," Amara repeated, the words like stones. "Was your job to watch as they killed women and children? As they burned our homes?" Jed closed his eyes briefly, the memories washing over him in brutal clarity. "No," he said quietly, "that wasn't my job." He looked at her then, really looked at her, seeing past the immediate threat she might pose to the deeper truth of who she was, a survivor, like him, shaped by loss and carrying the weight of the dead. With a slow, deliberate movement, Jed held out the buckskin talisman. "Here," he said, "it's yours." Amara took it quickly, folding it with reverent care and returning it to the leather pouch. She watched him warily, clearly trying to understand this unexpected reaction. "You're not going to deny it?" she asked, "or try to justify what was done?" Jed moved back to his chair, suddenly bone-weary. "No," he said simply. "There's no justifying what happened that day." A heavy silence fell between them, filled with the weight of shared history and divergent experiences of the same tragedy. Finally, Jed spoke again, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "If you want revenge, you should take it now," he said, gesturing to the rifle that still leaned against the chair. I won't stop you. Amara's eyes widened slightly, surprise replacing some of the hostility in her expression. You would let me kill you? Jed shrugged, the gesture containing a lifetime of weariness. I died a long time ago, he said. Just been walking around since then, out of habit. Something shifted in Amara's gaze, not softening exactly, but a new assessment taking place. The oath is not just for you, she said after a moment. There were others, the one who gave the orders. He is the one I seek most. Colonel Sullivan, Jed said, the name bitter on his tongue. Amara's sharp intake of breath confirmed his guess. You know him. I knew him, Jed corrected. Haven't seen him in years, not since... He trailed off, unwilling to revisit that particular memory. Red Wolf, Amar said suddenly, making the connection. The man at the stream. He is Sullivan's son. Victor, Jed confirmed. Got his father's mean streak, but none of his discipline. That was the problem. Amar absorbed this information in silence, her hands absently stroking the leather pouch that held her blood oath. I did not know the colonel had a son, she said, more to herself than to Jed. Reed was his mother's name, Jed explained. She died when he was young. Rumor was it was an Apache raid, but I never believed that. Sullivan was always too quick to blame the Apache for everything. Dawn was beginning to lighten the sky outside the cabin's small window. Soon a new day would begin, bringing with it decisions that couldn't be postponed. Jed rubbed his aching leg, considering their strange situation. You still set on going to Fort Apache? He asked finally. Amara nodded, her expression determined. My sister's children may still live. After the attack, many children were taken to the mission school there. Jed didn't have the heart to tell her what often happened to Apache children in those schools, how they were stripped of their language, their culture, their very names. If her sister's children had survived, they might not remember her or even want to. It's still a long journey, he said instead, and Red Wolf will be watching the trails now. Amara's gaze was steady. I have traveled far already. I will reach Fort Apache or die trying. Something in her quiet determination reminded Jed of Eleanor, that same stubborn resolve in the face of impossible odds. It stirred something he'd thought long dead within him. The horses need feeding, he said abruptly, rising from his chair, and your dress needs mending before you go anywhere. Rest today. Head out tomorrow when you're stronger. He didn't wait for her response, grabbing his hat from its peg by the door and stepping out into the cool dawn air. The first rays of sunlight were just touching the tops of the distant mountains, turning them gold against the pale blue sky. Jed stood on his porch for a long moment, breathing deeply, trying to make sense of the strange turn his life had taken in the space of a single day. An Apache woman with a blood oath bearing his name, the son of his former commanding officer. The past he'd tried so hard to outrun, suddenly circling back to find him. Behind him, the cabin door opened, and Amara stepped out. She had removed his coat and somehow managed to pin her torn dress in a way that preserved her modesty. Her feet were still bare, but she stood straight, her gaze fixed on the same distant mountains. My sister died 2 winters ago, she said without preamble. Consumption took her. Before she wowed, she made me promise to find her children. 3 days ago, I heard rumors in the trading post that some Apache children had been returned to their families at Fort Apache. Jed nodded, understanding the hope that drove her. I'll help you get there, he said, surprising himself. Not because of what happened before, but because it's the right thing to do now. Amara turned to look at him, her expression unreadable in the early morning light. Why should I trust you? It was a fair question, one Jed had no easy answer for. You shouldn't, he said honestly, but I'm probably your best chance of getting to Fort Apache alive. A flicker of something, resignation perhaps, or pragmatic acceptance, crossed Amara's face. Then we have an agreement, she said. Until Fort Apache. Jed nodded, the weight of this new commitment settling on his shoulders. Until Fort Apache, he echoed. Together they stood in silence as the sun rose fully above the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard. 2 broken people bound by a shared past, facing an uncertain future with nothing but necessity and ghosts between them. The morning unfolded with the practiced rhythm of ranch life. Jed fed and watered the horses, checked the garden, and repaired a loose board on the corral fence. Amara, after initial hesitation, busied herself with domestic tasks, sweeping the cabin floor, washing the previous night's dishes, examining her torn dress with a critical eye. They worked in parallel, rarely speaking, each aware of the other's presence but maintaining a careful distance. The revelations of the night before hung in the air between them, acknowledged but not discussed further. By midday, the desert heat had settled over the ranch like a heavy blanket. Jed returned to the cabin to find Amara sitting at the table, his sewing kit open before her, deftly repairing her dress with small, even stitches. "You should eat something," he said, setting down his tools. "Got some jerky and dried apples." Amara nodded without looking up, her attention focused on her work. Jed placed the food on the table, then moved to the water bucket, filling a dipper to quench his thirst. As he drank, he noticed Amara's occasional winces as she shifted position. Her feet, still raw from running barefoot, were clearly causing her pain. Without comment, Jed retrieved a small hinge from a shelf and set it beside her on the table. "Yarrow salve," he explained when she glanced up questioningly. "Good for cuts and sores." Amara eyed the tin, then Jed, her expression guarded. "Thank you," she said finally, returning to her sewing. Jed busied himself preparing a simple midday meal, acutely aware of the strangeness of the situation. It had been 3 years since anyone else had occupied this cabin. 3 years of silence, broken only by his own footsteps, his own breathing. Now there was another presence, another heartbeat. It was both unsettling and oddly comforting. As they ate, Jed found himself stealing glances at Amara, trying to reconcile this flesh and blood woman with the abstract concept of survivor that had haunted him for years. How many others had escaped the slaughter at the village? How many carried blood oaths with names like his, nurturing vengeance like a precious flame? "Why didn't you do it?" he asked suddenly, the question emerging before he could reconsider. Amara looked up from her meal, her dark eyes assessing. "Do what?" "Kill me," Jed said bluntly. "Last night, the rifle was right there. I was asleep in the chair for a while. You could have ended it." Amara was silent for a long moment, her expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "I considered it," she admitted finally, "but it would not have been honorable. You saved me from Red Wolf. A life for a life." There was more to it than that, Jed suspected, but he didn't press. Instead, he nodded once in acknowledgement and returned to his meal. The conversation lapsed back into silence, but it was a different quality of silence now. Less hostile, more contemplative. After they had eaten, Jed gathered his tools to return to his fence mending. At the door, he paused, looking back at Amara. "I'll be bringing a horse in from the south pasture this afternoon," he said. "Bay mare, gentle enough but spirited when she needs to be. She'll get you to Fort Apache." Amara met his gaze steadily. "I cannot pay you for a horse." "Not asking for payment," Jed replied. "Just returning her to where she belongs." He left before Amara could respond, the screen door closing softly behind him. The double meaning of his words hung in the air, and as he walked toward the pasture, Jed wondered if he was trying to convince Amara or himself. Amara watched through the cabin window as Jed disappeared toward the southern pasture, his slight limp more pronounced after the morning's work. When he was out of sight, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The events of the past day had left her disoriented, her carefully laid plans disrupted by this unexpected encounter with the very man who had been on her list of those to find. Jedediah Rollins, ghost to the soldiers, a man whose tracking skills had led to the destruction of her village and the death of her family. Yet he was not what she had expected. There was no arrogance in him, no defensive justification of what had happened. Instead, she had found a man haunted by his own ghosts, living in self-imposed exile with the memories of a family lost as tragically as her own. Amara looked around the cabin, seeing it with new eyes. The children's beds built into the alcove, never dismantled despite years of disuse. The woman's touch is still evident in small details, the embroidered cushion on the rocking chair, the pressed wildflowers in a frame on the wall. A home preserved as if in amber, waiting for inhabitants who would never return. Her gaze fell on the photograph Jed had identified the night before, his wife and children. The woman had a kind face, with eyes that seemed to look directly at the viewer. The children were solemn in the way of all children forced to sit still for photographs, but there was happiness evident in their expressions. A family, just like hers had been. With careful movements, Amara retrieved the leather pouch from the pocket of Jed's coat, which still lay folded beside her makeshift bed. From it, she withdrew the piece of buckskin with Jed's name burned into it. Beside it was a second hide, this one bearing the name Colonel Sullivan. The blood oath had been her sister's idea originally. Delphina had always been the more pragmatic of the two, even in grief. Write their names, she had said as they huddled in the forest, watching their village burn. Remember them. One day they will answer for what they have done. Amara had carried the names for 5 years, first as a burning desire for revenge, then as a heavier burden, the responsibility of justice for those who could no longer seek it for themselves. She had imagined confronting these men 1,000 times, had rehearsed the words she would say, the accusations she would make. Never once had she imagined offering one of them a meal at her own table or accepting his aid in reaching Fort Apache. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention back to the window. Jed was returning, leading a beautiful bay mare behind his own mount. The horse moved with easy grace, her coat gleaming copper in the afternoon sun. She was, as Jed had said, spirited but gentle. Amara could see it in the way she carried herself, head high but following Jed's lead without resistance. Amara's hand closed around the buckskin talisman, feeling the texture of the hide, the slight indentations where the name had been burned into it. 5 years of purpose, of singular focus, now complicated by unexpected compassion from the enemy himself. What would her sister say? What would her husband think, or her father, to see her accepting help from one of those responsible for their deaths? But they were not here. Only she remained, with choices to make that they would never have to face. With deliberate care, Amara returned the talismans to their pouch and slipped it back into the pocket of Jed's coat. She would keep her oath, but how and when it would be fulfilled was a question she could no longer answer with certainty. Outside, Jed dismounted stiffly, his leg clearly troubling him more than usual. He led both horses to the water trough, speaking softly to the mare as she drank. There was gentleness in his handling of the animals, a quiet respect that Amara had not expected. Making a sudden decision, Amara reached for the tin of yarrow salve Jed had offered earlier. Then, checking that her repaired dress was secure, she stepped out into the afternoon sun to meet the horse that would carry her to the next chapter of her journey, and perhaps to the fulfillment of her oath in ways she had never anticipated. The mare's name is Willow, Jed explained as he adjusted the saddle for Amara's smaller frame. She had been born on his ranch 4 years earlier, daughter of his own gelding sister. He spoke of the horse's lineage with quiet pride, the first real enthusiasm Amara had heard in his voice. "She'll serve you well," he said, patting the mare's neck. "Strong but not stubborn, smart enough to avoid trouble." Amara stood beside the corral fence, watching Jed work. Her dress, now mended as best she could manage, hung more securely around her frame. She had washed her hair at the rain barrel and rebraided it in the traditional style of her people. The physical restoration had brought with it a measure of dignity that she had feared lost during her desperate flight from Red Wolf and his men. "I will take good care of her," Amara said, stepping forward to stroke Willow's velvety nose. The horse nickered softly, seeming to accept her touch as her due. Jed nodded, satisfied with his adjustments to the saddle. "We'll leave at first light tomorrow," he said. "Should reach Fort Apache in 2 days if the weather holds." Amara's hand stilled on Willow's nose. "We?" Jed's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes. Determination, perhaps. "Red Wolf will be watching the trails," he said, "and there are other dangers between here and the fort. Better if you don't travel alone." Amara studied him, trying to discern his true motivation. Was it guilt that drove him to accompany her? A desire for absolution? Or something more pragmatic, ensuring that she reached her destination and left his territory for good? "You do not need to do this," she said carefully. Jed's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I know that," he replied, "but I'm doing it anyway." Before Amara could respond, a sharp pain lanced through her foot as she shifted her weight. She couldn't quite suppress a wince, and Jed's gaze immediately dropped to her bare feet, still raw and cut from her flight through the desert. "You use the salve?" he asked, his tone practical rather than concerned. Amara nodded. "It helps, but you can't ride like that," Jed finished for her. "Come on, got something that might work." He led her back to the cabin, his slight limp matching her careful steps in an unconscious synchronization. Inside, Jed rummaged through a trunk at the foot of his bed, eventually withdrawing a pair of worn leather moccasins. Eleanor's, he said, holding them out, might be a bit large, but better than nothing. Amara hesitated, uncomfortable with the idea of wearing a dead woman's shoes. In her culture, the possessions of the deceased were often buried with them or destroyed, allowing the spirit to journey unencumbered to the next world. Jed seemed to read her reluctance. She would have wanted them used, he said simply. Eleanor never believed in waste. Something in his tone, a quiet certainty free of manipulation, convinced Amara. She accepted the moccasins with a small nod of thanks and sat on the edge of a chair to try them on. They were indeed slightly large, but not unworkably so. The soft leather felt cool against her abraded skin, and when she stood, the difference was immediate. Protection and support where before there had been only painful vulnerability. "Thank you," she said, the words still feeling strange on her tongue when directed at this man. Jed acknowledged her thanks with a slight inclination of his head, then turned to the stove. "Should start supper," he said. "Long ride tomorrow." As he busied himself with meal preparations, Amara remained by the window, testing the feel of the moccasins as she shifted her weight from foot to foot. Outside, Willow grazed peacefully in the corral, occasionally lifting her head to gaze toward the horizon, as if already anticipating the journey ahead. A journey Amara would not be making alone as she had expected. Instead, she would travel with the very man whose name she carried in her blood oath, a twist of fate so unexpected that she could almost believe the spirits were laughing at her carefully laid plans. But perhaps there was purpose in this strange development. Perhaps the true path to fulfilling her oath lay not in swift vengeance, but in understanding. In witnessing Jedediah Rollins not as an abstract enemy, but as a flawed human being carrying his own burdens of grief and regret. The thought was unsettling, challenging years of carefully nurtured hatred. Amara pushed it aside, focusing instead on the practical reality of her situation. She would accept Jed's escort to Fort Apache because it increased her chances of success. Nothing more. The blood oath remained. Justice would still be served, but the form it might take was becoming less clear with each passing hour in Jedediah Rollins's company blood oath. Part 3, Journey in Peril. Night fell over the ranch, bringing with it a profound desert silence, broken only by the occasional call of a coyote in the distance. After supper, Jed had retreated to the porch, leaving Amara alone in the cabin with her thoughts. Through the window, she could see his silhouette against the darkening sky, motionless except for the occasional movement as he sipped from a tin cup. Not coffee, Amara suspected, but the whiskey she had noticed on a high shelf, a temptation kept deliberately out of easy reach, but not eliminated entirely. The day's revelations and decisions had left her mentally exhausted, yet sleep remained elusive. Tomorrow they would begin the journey to Fort Apache, bringing her one step closer to finding her sister's children, if they still lived, and to confronting Colonel Sullivan, the man who had ordered the destruction of her village. Sullivan, father of Red Wolf, the man who had pursued her through the desert with such vicious intent. The connection was both surprising and somehow inevitable, hatred passing from father to son like a poisoned inheritance. Amara's gaze drifted to the small beds built into the alcove, empty now for 3 years, according to what Jed had shared during their sparse conversation over supper. His son would have been 8 now, his daughter 6, lost to the fever that had claimed so many during that terrible season. In some ways, Jedediah Rollins was as much a survivor of tragedy as she was. The thought brought no comfort, only a hollow recognition of shared suffering that transcended the divisions between their peoples. A soft knock at the door startled her from her reverie. Jed entered, his movements careful, as if concerned about disturbing her. The smell of whiskey clung to him, but his eyes were clear, his manner controlled. "Sorry," he said, noticing her wary posture. "Just need to get something." He crossed to the trunk at the foot of his bed, opening it with practiced ease. From within, he withdrew a worn leather bundle, which he brought to the table. Unwrapping it carefully, he revealed a pair of revolvers, well-maintained despite their obvious age. "Thought you might want to learn how to use these," Jed said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Trail to Fort Apache isn't always friendly." Amara approached the table slowly, eyeing the weapons with a mixture of wariness and practical interest. Her people had used rifles and pistols when they could acquire them, valuing their effectiveness in hunting and defense. But such weapons were strictly controlled by the army, rarely available to those confined to reservations. "I know rifles," she said, reaching out to touch one of the revolvers tentatively. "Not these." Jed nodded, apparently unsurprised. "Colt Navy," he explained, picking up one of the pistols with practiced ease. "Older model, but reliable. 6 shots before reloading." With patient precision, he demonstrated how to check if the weapon was loaded, how to aim, how the trigger pull differed from a rifle. Amara listened intently, absorbing the information with the quick intelligence that had always been her strength. "Why are you doing this?" she asked as Jed handed her the unloaded pistol to feel its weight and balance. "Arming someone who has sworn to kill you seems unwise." A ghost of a smile, the first Amara had seen, flitted across Jed's face. "If you wanted me dead, I'd be dead already," he said simply. "Figure we both have bigger concerns now." Amara considered this, turning the revolver over in her hands. The metal was cool and heavy, the grip worn smooth by years of use. It was a practical tool, neither good nor evil in itself, only in how it was used. "Your wife's?" she asked, noting the smaller grip that fit her hand reasonably well. Jed nodded, something softening in his expression. "Eleanor was a good shot," he said, "better than me with a pistol, though she'd never admit it." The mention of his wife seemed to open something in Jed, a door kept firmly closed until now. He sat at the table gesturing for Amar to take the other chair and began to clean the second revolver with practiced movements. "We came out here after the war," he said, his voice taking on a distant quality. "I'd seen enough fighting, enough death. Wanted something simple, something clean." His hands moved methodically, disassembling the pistol with unconscious skill. Eleanor understood that. She'd worked as a nurse during the conflicts, seen the same things I had, different angle. Amara listened silently, aware that she was being granted a rare glimpse into this taciturn man's inner life. "Built this place with my own hands," Jed continued. "Every log, every nail. Eleanor planted the garden. Said we needed beauty as well as sustenance." A brief pause, his hands stilling momentarily. "When the children came, it felt like redemption somehow. Like maybe all the ugliness I'd been part of could be balanced by something good." The raw honesty in his voice caught Amara off guard. This was not the calculated confession of a man seeking absolution, but the halting reflection of someone trying to make sense of his own life. "But it doesn't work that way," Jed said, his tone hardening again as he reassembled the pistol with quick, efficient movements. "One good thing doesn't erase a bad one. The debt remains." Amara thought of her blood oath, of the names inscribed on buckskin, of justice demanded and still unpaid. "Yes," she agreed softly. "The debt remains." Jed looked up, meeting her eyes directly. In the lamplight, his face showed every line of hardship and loss, a map of a difficult life etched into skin and bone. "I can't bring back your family," he said. "Can't undo what was done. But I can get you to Fort Apache, can help you find your sister's children. That much at least I can do." It was an offer made without expectation of forgiveness, without hope of redemption, simply a practical action, a small counterbalance against an immeasurable wrong. Amara found herself nodding slowly. "Then we will go to Fort Apache," she said, "and after we will see what remains to be done." Jed held her gaze a moment longer, then returned his attention to the weapons on the table. "We leave at dawn," he said, his voice once again the practical tone of a man discussing a journey. "Pack light, travel fast." As the night deepened around the small cabin, Amara lay on her makeshift bed by the stove, listening to the soft sounds of Jed moving about, preparing for their departure. Tomorrow would bring them one step closer to Fort Apache, to her sister's children, to Colonel Sullivan. One step closer to the fulfillment of her blood oath, in whatever form that might ultimately take. The path ahead was unclear, but for the first time in years, Amara felt the stirring of something beyond revenge, a possibility she had not allowed herself to consider before. Not forgiveness, never that, but perhaps, in some small way, a reckoning that brought more than just more death in its wake. Outside, a coyote called to its companions, the sound haunting and ancient against the vast silence of the desert night. Inside the cabin, two survivors of different tragedies prepared for a journey neither had anticipated, bound by a strange symmetry of loss and a shared destination that promised either resolution or further complication of the debts between them. Dawn arrived with gentle persistence, painting the desert in hues of pink and gold. Jed had been awake for hours, loading supplies into saddlebags, checking and rechecking the horses. Sleep had proven elusive, chased away by memories and the weight of the journey ahead. Amara emerged from the cabin as the first rays of sunlight crested the distant mountains. She wore her mended dress and Eleanor's moccasins, her dark hair freshly braided, her expression composed. At her hip hung one of the Colt Navy revolvers, secured in a leather holster Jed had adjusted for her smaller frame the night before. "Morning," Jed greeted her, tightening the cinch on his gelding saddle. "Coffee's hot by the stove if you want some." Amara shook her head. "We should leave now, while it is still cool." Jed nodded, appreciating her practicality. He handed her Willow's reins, watching as she checked the saddle and bridle with practiced motions. Not her first time around horses then. Another assumption challenged. They mounted in silence, Amara adapting easily to Willow's gait as the mare danced sideways with morning energy. Jed led the way, heading northeast toward the mountains that rose blue and distant on the horizon. Behind them, the small ranch grew smaller, a patch of human endeavor swallowed by the vastness of the desert landscape. For the first hour, they rode without speaking, each lost in private thoughts. The rhythm of hoofbeats on packed earth and the occasional call of a desert bird were the only sounds that broke the morning stillness. The sun climbed higher, its heat intensifying as they traversed the open terrain. "We'll follow the dry creek bed," Jed said finally, gesturing to the shallow depression ahead, where seasonal rains had carved a path through the land. "Provide some cover, less chance of being spotted from a distance." Amara nodded her understanding, scanning the horizon with watchful eyes. "Red Wolf will be looking for us." "For you," Jed corrected. "He will assume you are with me," Amara replied, "after your confrontation." Jed couldn't argue with that assessment. Red Wolf was many things: cruel, arrogant, quick to anger, but he wasn't stupid. He would have connected the dots by now, recognizing Jed's intervention as more than a chance encounter. They descended into the creek bed, the horses picking their way carefully over smooth stones and patches of sand. The banks rose on either side, not high enough to block the sun, but sufficient to hide them from distant observers. It was a calculated risk, easier to be ambushed in such a confined space, but better than being spotted crossing open terrain. "You know this land well," Amara observed after a time. Jed nodded. "Scouted it for years before and during the war." Amara was silent for a moment, absorbing this information. "You were good at your baby," she said finally, the words neutral but laden with unspoken meaning. "Too good," Jed replied, a bitter edge to his voice. "That was the problem." The conversation lapsed again, the weight of their shared history pressing down like the desert heat. They continued eastward, following the winding path of the dry creek as it curved toward a stand of cottonwoods that marked the presence of actual water, their first planned stop. The sun was high overhead when they reached the small oasis, a spring bubbling up from beneath a rocky outcropping, creating a pool of clear water surrounded by greenery. Cottonwoods provided blessed shade, their leaves rustling gently in the slight breeze. "We'll rest here," Jed said, dismounting stiffly. His bad leg had stiffened during the long ride, and he took a moment to stretch it, masking a wince. "Let the horses drink. Continue in an hour or so when it's not so hot." Amara slid gracefully from Willow's back, leading the mare to the pool. She watched the horse drink, her own thirst evident in the way she eyed the water, but did not immediately partake herself. "It's clean," Jed assured her, filling his canteen. "Spring-fed. Been stopping here for years." Only then did Amara kneel beside the pool, cupping her hands to drink. The water was cool and sweet, untainted by alkali or minerals that made so many desert water sources unpalatable. They settled in the shade of the largest cottonwood, a respectful distance between them. Jed unwrapped a bundle of jerky and hardtack, offering half to Amara, who accepted with a small nod of thanks. They ate in companionable silence, the horses grazing on the sparse grass nearby. "Your leg pains you," Amara said suddenly, her observant gaze noting the way Jed stretched it out before him. Jed shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. Old wound, acts up sometimes. Arrow? Amar asked, her gaze dropping to where his pants covered the injury. Comanche, Jed confirmed. 8 years back. Went in clean but got infected. Amar's expression changed suddenly, a flicker of professional interest replacing her usual reserve. May I see it? Jed hesitated, surprised by the request. Then, with a small shrug, he rolled up his pant leg, revealing the puckered scar that ran from mid-calf to just below his knee and on the outer side of his right leg. Amara leaned forward, studying the old injury with clinical detachment. The bone was damaged. Cracked, Jed said. Doc wanted to take the leg, but I wouldn't let him. A wise choice, Amara murmured, her fingers hovering just above the scar without touching it. But it was not treated properly. The muscles are tight, contracted. Jed rolled his pant leg down again, uncomfortable with the scrutiny. Gets the job done, he said gruffly. Just complains about it sometimes. A ghost of a smile touched Amara's lips, there and gone so quickly Jed almost missed it. I could help, she offered. I know remedies for such injuries, plants that grow near here. The offer took Jed by surprise. He studied her face, looking for ulterior motives, but finding only practical concern. Why would you help me? He asked bluntly. Amara met his gaze steadily. A blood debt can be paid in many ways, she said. Not all require blood. Before Jed could respond, the sound of distant hoofbeats reached them. Both tensed, hands moving instinctively to their weapons. Jed rose to his feet, ignoring the protest from his bad leg, and moved to the edge of the oasis where he could scan the surrounding terrain. Riders, he said, his voice low. 3 of them, coming from the west. Amara joined him, her body coiled with tension. Red Wolf? Jed squinted against the sunlight, trying to make out details through the heat haze. Can't tell yet, but they're following the creek bed. Our tracks. They exchanged a quick glance, understanding passing between them without words. There was no time to flee. The riders would catch up to them in open terrain. Better to make a stand here, with water and cover. Get the horses, Jed instructed, moving back to retrieve his rifle from his saddle. Bring them behind the rocks. Less chance of them bolting if shooting starts. Amara moved swiftly, gathering the reins of both horses and leading them to the partial shelter of the rocky outcropping. Jed checked his Winchester, then positioned himself behind a large cottonwood trunk that offered both concealment and a clear view of the approach. The riders drew closer, their forms resolving through the heat shimmer. 3 men riding hard, dust rising from their horses' hooves, and in the lead, the distinctive red kerchief around his neck. Victor Red Wolf Sullivan. It's them, Jed confirmed, his voice tight with controlled tension. Red Wolf and his boys. Amar's hand moved to the revolver at her hip. What do we do? Jed considered their options, weighing the risks. We're outnumbered, but we've got position. Could try to scare them off again, but they came prepared this time, Amara finished for him, noting the rifles carried by all 3 men. Jed nodded grimly. I know these types. They won't back down a second time. Makes them look weak. He glanced at Amara, seeing the determination in her face. You ever killed a man? Amara's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. A memory, perhaps, or a private grief. Yes, she said simply. Jed accepted this without surprise. Survival on the frontier often required such actions, regardless of race or gender. Stay hidden, he instructed. Let me talk to them first. Maybe there's a way to avoid bloodshed. Amara's skeptical look suggested she thought this unlikely, but she moved back into the shadows of the rocks, one hand on Willow's neck to keep the nervous mare quiet. The riders slowed as they approached the oasis, clearly aware of the tactical disadvantage of rushing in. They stopped about 50 yards out, just within shouting distance. Rollins, Red Wolf called, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. We know you're in there. Got your tracks, plain as day. Jed remained silent, watching through a gap in the cottonwood branches as the 3 men spread out slightly, preparing for potential conflict. Just want to talk, Red Wolf continued, though the rifle across his saddle suggested otherwise. About your Apache friend. Jed exchanged a glance with Amara, who shook her head slightly, clearly distrusting Red Wolf's intentions. Jed shared her skepticism, but decided to respond, if only to buy time. Nothing to talk about, Red Wolf, he called back. You're trespassing again. A harsh laugh answered him. Trespassing? This ain't your land, Rollins. We're well past your boundaries. Jed knew Red Wolf was right. They had left his property hours ago. Out here, the only law was what a man could enforce with his own hands or gun. The woman's under my protection, Jed stated firmly. You harm her, you answer to me. Simple as that. The three men conferred briefly, their voices too low to carry to the oasis. Then Red Wolf urged his horse a few steps closer. Heard some interesting news in town last night, he called, a new edge to his voice. About you and the Apache, about Fort Apache. Jed felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Beside him, Amara had gone very still, her dark eyes fixed on Red Wolf with renewed intensity. Don't know what you're talking about, Jed responded, though he knew his denial lacked conviction. Sure you do, Red Wolf continued, clearly enjoying Jed's discomfort. You were there, weren't you, when those Apache got what was coming to them? My pa told me all about it, how they fought back, had to be put down like rabid toots. Jed's grip tightened on his rifle, anger rising hot in his chest at Red Wolf's callous description of what had been in reality a massacre of largely unarmed people. Your pa tell you everything that happened that day? Jed challenged, unable to contain himself. Or just the parts that made him look good? A flash of anger crossed Red Wolf's face. My pa's a hero, defended settlers against savages for 20 years. Your pa's a butcher, Jed replied coldly, and you're following right in his footsteps. Red Wolf's face contorted with rage. He raised his rifle, but the younger man beside him grabbed his arm, saying something urgent that didn't carry to where Jed and Amara waited. After a tense moment, Red Wolf lowered the weapon, though his expression remained murderous. This ain't over, Rollins, he called. You think you can protect her? My pa's coming back. He's got friends in high places now. They'll deal with both of you. With that ominous warning, Red Wolf wheeled his horse around, spitting into the dust. His companions followed, and soon the three riders were disappearing back the way they had come, dust rising in their wake. Jed remained tense, watching until they were well out of sight. Only then did he lower his rifle, letting out a long breath. They gave up too easily, Amar said, voicing Jed's own concern. He nodded. Red Wolf's not the type to back down. Something else is going on. He turned to Amara, his expression grave. You heard what he said about his father coming back. Amara's face had gone very still, a mask that revealed nothing of her thoughts. Colonel Sullivan, she said, the name carrying all the weight of her blood oath. If he's back in the territory, Jed said slowly, things just got a lot more complicated. Amara's hand went to the hidden pouch that contained her talismans. Or simpler, she said, her voice hard with purpose. Jed studied her, understanding the dangerous path her thoughts were taking. Sullivan is not a man to be underestimated, he warned. He's got connections in the Army, in Washington, and a personal hatred for Apache that goes beyond reason. As I have for him, Amar replied, her eyes meeting Jed's without flinching. He ordered the death of my family, my husband, my son. Her voice caught slightly on the last word, the only crack in her composed facade. Jed felt a fresh wave of guilt wash over him. He had been there that day, had seen the aftermath of Sullivan's orders, had failed to stop it. We need to keep moving, he said, pushing aside the memories that threatened to overwhelm him. If Red Wolf's gone to get reinforcements, we need to be far from here when they return. Amara nodded, her practical nature reasserting itself. Which way? Jed considered their options. The direct route to Fort Apache would take them through open country, easy to track and ambush. The alternative was longer but offered more cover, a series of canyons and forested areas where two riders could lose themselves if necessary. Well, he decided, through the high country, harder going but more places to hide if we need to. They prepared to leave quickly, refilling canteens and checking their weapons. As Jed mounted his gelding, grimacing slightly at the pain in his leg, Amara paused beside him. Tonight, she said, I will show you how to ease the pain in your leg. There are plants in the high country that will help. Jed looked down at her, surprised again by this unexpected offer of assistance. Weebang. Amara's expression was unreadable. Because we both need you strong for what lies ahead, she said simply, then turned to Mount Willow with fluid grace. As they rode north, leaving the safety of the oasis behind, Jed pondered Amara's words. Was her concern purely practical, ensuring that her guide to Fort Apache remained capable? Or was there something more complex at work, an acknowledgement of their strange tentative alliance against a common enemy? Either way, Jed found himself grateful for her pragmatism. The road ahead would be difficult enough without the constant gnawing pain in his leg as an additional burden. And if Red Wolf's threat proved true, if Colonel Sullivan was indeed returning to the territory, they would need every advantage they could muster. The sun beat down relentlessly as they climbed higher into the rugged terrain. Two solitary figures moving through a vast and indifferent landscape, bound together by circumstance and the shadows of a shared past that neither could escape. Blood Oath, Part 4, High Country. By late afternoon, they had climbed into rougher country, red rock formations, twisted junipers, and deep canyons cutting through the elevated plateau. The air cooled as wildlife emerged from the day's heat. Jed led them along narrow game trails, his scout training evident in choosing routes offering both progress and protection. Hidden canyon ahead with a spring, he called back. Good place to camp. The trail descended into a ravine, walls rising on either side to create a natural corridor, a perfect ambush spot. Jed's shoulders tensed. Stay close, he murmured. If anything happens, ride hard and don't look back. Amara moved Willow alongside his gelding, both riders with hands near their weapons, alert for danger. The ravine curved sharply to the left, then opened suddenly into a hidden canyon, a secluded basin perhaps half a mile across, enclosed by steep rock walls on all sides. A small stream trickled down one wall, feeding a clear pool surrounded by cottonwoods and willows. The floor of the canyon was carpeted with grass and wildflowers, a hidden oasis in the harsh landscape. Jed relaxed slightly as they emerged into the open space, though his vigilance didn't waver. Not many know about this place, he said, dismounting near the pool. Used to bring Eleanor and the children here sometimes. Called it our secret garden. The personal disclosure was unexpected, offered without prompting. Amara studied Jed as she dismounted, noting the softening in his expression as he looked around the peaceful canyon. This place held memories for him, good ones. It seemed a rarity in his otherwise haunted existence. It is beautiful, she acknowledged, leading Willow to the pool to drink. Hidden from the world. Jed nodded, unbuckling his saddle. That's why I thought of it. Good place to rest without worrying about Red Wolf finding us. Only one way in, easy to defend. They set up camp with efficient movements, each attending to specific tasks without need for discussion. Jed gathered firewood while Amara unsaddled the horses and arranged their bedrolls near a natural alcove in the canyon wall. By the time the sun began to set, painting the rock walls in shades of orange and gold, a small fire was burning cheerfully, and coffee was brewing in a battered pot. Amara had disappeared briefly, returning with an assortment of plants gathered from around the canyon. Some Jed recognized, others unfamiliar to him. She sat cross-legged near the fire, sorting through her harvest with focused attention. What are those for? Jed asked, stirring the pot of beans that would serve as their dinner. Your leg? Amara replied without looking up. And to add to the food, white man's cooking lacks flavor. There was a hint of teasing in her tone, so subtle Jed almost missed it. He found himself responding with a small snort of amusement. Never claimed to be a chef. As the twilight deepened, they ate their simple meal in companionable silence. The beans, enhanced with Amara's wild herbs, were indeed more flavorful than Jed's usual fare. After they had finished, Amara gestured to a fallen log near the fire. Sit, she instructed. Roll up your pant leg. Jed hesitated, unaccustomed to being tended to by anyone since Eleanor's death. Then, with a small shrug of surrender, he did as she asked, exposing the scarred leg to the firelight. Amara knelt beside him, her expression focused and professional. From a small bundle, she withdrew several types of crushed leaves mixed with what appeared to be animal fat, forming a greenish-brown paste. This will be cold, she warned before applying the mixture to the old wound with gentle but firm pressure. Jed tensed at the initial contact, then gradually relaxed as a cooling sensation spread through the chronically inflamed tissue. Amara's hands moved with practiced skill, working the paste into the scar tissue and surrounding muscle, her touch clinical rather than intimate. Where did you learn this? Jed asked, watching her work. My grandmother was a healer, Amar replied, her focus remaining on her task. She taught me which plants bring health, which bring death, how to prepare them, how to use them. A shadow crossed her face. She died in the attack on our village. Jed absorbed this new piece of information, another individual loss within the larger tragedy. I'm sorry, he said inadequately. Amar's hands paused momentarily, then resumed their methodical work. Many skills were lost that day, she said. Many stories, many songs, things that can never be recovered. The weight of cultural extinction hung heavy in her words, not just lives lost, but an entire way of being. Knowledge accumulated over generations, scattered like ashes in the wind. Your sister's children, Jed said after a moment. If they're at the mission school, they will have forgotten. Amara finished for him, her voice tight with controlled emotion. Their language, their songs, their names, the white missionaries see it as salvation. We see it as another kind of death. Jed had no response to this truth. He had seen the mission schools, understood their purpose in the government's larger plan to civilize the native peoples, had recognized the cruelty beneath the veneer of Christian charity, but had done nothing to oppose it. Why did you do it? Amar asked suddenly, eyes lifting from his leg to his face. Lead the soldiers to our village? Jed met her gaze, owing her the truth. Orders. Sullivan wanted to make an example. Said your people had raided settlements. That was not true, Amara said firmly. We lived peacefully. I know, Jed admitted. I knew even then. He trailed off, his justifications hollow even to himself. But you followed orders, Amara concluded, judgment heavy in her voice. Jed looked into the fire. Until I didn't. Amara's hand stilled. What do you mean? When I saw women and children being cut down, I tried to stop it. Jed's voice tightened. When that failed, I drew my weapon, fired on my own side, killed 2 soldiers, created enough confusion for some to escape. Understanding dawned in Amar's expression. That is why you left the army. Jed nodded grimly. Sullivan would have had me court-martialed, probably hanged, but the war was winding down. Too much paperwork, too many questions about what really happened to that day, so they let me resign quietly. Go back to my family. And Sullivan? Amara pressed. What happened to him? Promoted, Jed said bitterly. That's the way it works. The higher-ups needed someone with his particular skills during the final campaigns. Man who's willing to do anything, no matter how brutal, is valuable in their eyes. Amara was silent for a long moment, absorbing this new information. Her hands resumed their work on Jed's leg, though her touch seemed different now, less clinical, more thoughtful. You tried to save some of us, she said finally, her voice neutral. Not enough, Jed replied, the familiar guilt washing over him. Too late, too little. Doesn't erase what happened before. Amara finished applying the paste, then wrapped his leg with a strip of clean cloth from her bundle. No, she agreed as she secured the binding. It does not erase the past, but it changes how I see you in the present. She sat back on her heels, regarding him with an expression Jed couldn't quite interpret. Not forgiveness, certainly, but perhaps a new understanding, a recognition of complexity, where before there had been only a simplistic image of enemy. Rest now, she instructed, rising gracefully to her feet. The medicine needs time to work. Jed nodded, suddenly exhausted by the emotional weight of their exchange. He stretched his leg experimentally, surprised to find the chronic pain already somewhat diminished, replaced by a pleasant cooling sensation. Thank you, he said, the words encompassing more than just the treatment of his physical ailment. Amara acknowledged his gratitude with a slight inclination of her head, then moved to check on the horses, leaving Jed alone with his thoughts by the fire. The canyon was quiet except for the soft murmur of the small stream and the occasional pop from the burning logs. Above, stars began to appear in the deepening blue of the sky, countless points of light unmarred by the smoke and haze of civilization. Jed found himself wondering what Eleanor would think of his current situation. On the run with an Apache woman he had once helped wrong, heading toward a confrontation with his former commanding officer. Would she understand his need to make what amends he could, however inadequate? Or would she urge caution, remind him of the children who needed their father alive? But the children were gone now. Eleanor was gone. There was no one left to be cautious for. no one whose welfare depended on his survival, except perhaps for Amara and the missing children she sought. They needed him to reach Fort Apache, to navigate the complexities of dealing with the military authorities there. After that, Jed had no plan. One day at a time was all he could manage now, one foot in front of the other on a path leading to an uncertain destination. As the night deepened around them, Jed rolled down his pant leg and leaned back against the log, watching as Amara returned to the fire. She moved with a natural grace that reminded him of Eleanor, not in specifics, but in the confident economy of her movements, the absence of wasted energy or unnecessary gestures. "We should sleep in shifts," he suggested as she settled on her bedroll across the fire. "Just in case." Amara nodded her agreement. "I will take first watch," she offered. "The medicine will work better if you rest now." Too tired to argue, Jed stretched out on his bedroll, his rifle within easy reach. The paste on his leg had begun to work its magic, the chronic pain receding to a dull, manageable ache. As he drifted towards sleep, Jed found himself thinking that this was the first time in 3 years that someone had tended to his pain, rather than him simply enduring it alone. It was a small thing, perhaps a temporary easing of a permanent condition, but in that moment it felt like a rare and precious gift, a moment of connection in a life defined by isolation, a brief respite from the relentless weight of the past. Jed's last conscious thought before sleep claimed him was that perhaps this journey would bring some measure of peace to Amara, even if it could never fully repay the debt he owed her people. And if that was all he could offer, a small step toward healing rather than complete absolution, then it would have to be enough. Amara watched Jed sleep, his weathered face relaxed in repose. Without the lines of guilt and grief, he looked younger, more like the man he might have been under different circumstances. The fire had burned to embers, barely illuminating their small camp. Beyond that circle of light, only the soft breathing of horses and murmur of the stream broke the silence. Amara's fingers traced the leather pouch containing her talismans. 2 names, 2 debts, one now her reluctant ally, the other still her sworn enemy. The evening's revelations had complicated her understanding of Jed. For 5 years she'd imagined confronting him, demanding justice. Never had she considered he might have turned against his own comrades to save her people. It didn't erase his culpability. He'd still led soldiers to her village. But the man across from her was neither the monster she'd imagined nor the hero he might claim to be, just a human occupying the gray territory where most people resided. A branch snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond their camp, and Amara's hand moved instinctively to the revolver at her side. She listened intently, every sense alert. After a moment, she relaxed slightly. Just an animal moving through the underbrush, not a human threat. Still, the momentary alarm reminded her of their precarious situation. Red Wolf knew they were heading toward Fort Apache. If his father truly was returning to the territory, both she and Jed faced enemies with resources and determination. Amara's thoughts turned to her sister's children, the purpose that had driven her on this long journey. Delphina had extracted the promise from her as she lay dying, her once vibrant face hollowed by consumption, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Find them, Amara. Find my little ones. Tell them who they are." A simple promise made out of love that had led Amara far from the small Apache community where she had taken refuge after the massacre. A promise that now seemed both more attainable and more complicated than when she had first set out. Would Jed truly help her navigate the complexities of Fort Apache, with its military bureaucracy and missionary influences? And if they found the children, what then? They would have been at the mission school for years now, their memories of their Apache heritage deliberately erased, replaced with white man's education and religion. Would they even want to know their true heritage? Or would they reject her as a reminder of a past they had been taught to despise? The questions circled in Amara's mind, unanswerable until the moment of truth arrived. All she could do was continue forward, one step at a time, and face whatever awaited her at journey's end. Across the fire, Jed stirred in his sleep, his brow furrowing as if in response to an unpleasant dream. His hand twitched toward his rifle, a soldier's instinct never fully dormant. Then he settled again, his breathing deep and regular. Amara found herself wondering about the man behind the name she had carried for so long. What had his life been like before their paths crossed so tragically? He had been a husband, a father, before becoming a figure in her personal mythology of vengeance. Had he been happy in that life? Had he been kind to his wife, gentle with his children? The photograph she had seen in his cabin suggested so, a family portrait showing not stern formality, but genuine affection. The small beds built for children who would never return to them. The way he kept Eleanor's possessions, offering her moccasins to Amara without hesitation. A man capable of love as well as violence, of loyalty as well as betrayal, of terrible mistakes and belated attempts at redemption. The complexity of this reality was harder to bear in some ways than the simpler narrative of monstrous enemy that Amara had constructed over the years. It required her to see Jed as fully human, with all the contradictions that entailed, to recognize that her own desire for justice or vengeance existed alongside other, more complicated emotions. Not forgiveness, she could not forgive what had happened to her family, her people, but perhaps understanding. Perhaps even, in time, a kind of peace. The night deepened around her, stars wheeling slowly overhead in their ancient patterns. Amara kept her vigil, watching over the man whose name she had carried next to her heart for 5 long years, wondering what the dawn would bring and what new revelations might await as they continued their journey toward Fort Apache and toward whatever reckoning lay beyond. Jed woke to the first hints of dawn lightening the eastern sky. He lay still for a moment, assessing his surroundings with the habitual caution of a former scout. The fire had burned down to cold ashes. The horses stood quietly in their small temporary corral, and across the dead fire Amara slept, her face peaceful in repose, one hand still near the revolver at her side. She had let him sleep through the night, he realized with a mixture of gratitude and concern, had taken the entire watch herself despite their agreement to share the duty. Jed sat up slowly, surprised to find the pain in his legs significantly diminished. Whatever Amara had used in her paste had worked better than any medicine he'd tried over the years. He stretched experimentally, feeling greater flexibility in the old wound than he had experienced in a long time. The small sounds of his movement caused Amara to stir, her eyes opening immediately, alert despite her exhaustion, focusing on Jed with quick recognition. "Morning, man," he said quietly. "You were supposed to wake me for my watch." Amara sat up, pushing her braid back over her shoulder. "You needed the rest," she said simply. "The medicine works better with deep sleep." Jed couldn't argue with the results, but he felt a twinge of guilt at having slept while she kept guard. "I'll get breakfast started," he offered, moving to rekindle the fire. "We should eat and move on. Still a long way to Fort Apache." They worked together with the easy efficiency of those accustomed to outdoor living, preparing a simple meal of coffee and cornmeal mush sweetened with a little molasses. As they ate, Jed outlined the day's journey. "We'll follow this canyon to its eastern end," he explained, "then climb up to the ridge. From there, we can see the valley that leads to the fort. We'll be exposed for a while, but can't be helped." Amara nodded, her practical nature accepting the necessity. "How far?" "If we push hard, we could reach the fort by nightfall," Jed said. "But might be better to make camp one more night, approach in the morning. Less chance of misunderstandings if we arrive in daylight." The unspoken concern hung between them. An Apache woman and a former scout with a complicated history approaching a military fort in the gathering darkness could lead to dangerous assumptions by nervous sentries. "Agreed," Amara said, finishing her coffee. "One more night." They broke camp efficiently, leaving little trace of their presence. As Jed checked the cinch on his saddle, he found Amara watching him with an unreadable expression. "What is it?" he asked, straightening. "Last night," she said, "you told me you tried to save my people, that you fired on your fellow soldiers." Jed nodded cautiously, unsure where this was leading. "Why?" Amara pressed. "Why risk your life for people you had helped to condemn?" It was a fair question, one Jed had asked himself many times over the years. He took his time answering, wanting to give her the truth rather than a convenient explanation. "Because there are lines that shouldn't be crossed," he said finally. "What Sullivan ordered that day, it wasn't war, it was slaughter. And I couldn't stand by and watch it happen. Not anymore." Amara studied him, her dark eyes searching his face for deception or evasion. Finding neither, she nodded slowly. "My husband would have said it was the awakening of your warrior spirit, the part of you that knows right from wrong beyond what others tell you." Jed looked away, uncomfortable with this generous interpretation of what he viewed as a belated and inadequate moral stand. Maybe, he said noncommittally, or maybe just a man finally facing what he'd become and not liking what he saw. Amara made no response to this, but as they mounted their horses and began to follow the canyon eastward, Jed sensed a subtle shift in her demeanor toward him. Not warmth exactly, but perhaps a thawing of the cold judgment she had carried since recognizing his name. Blood Oath, Part 5, Confrontation and Resolution. They rode in companionable silence, the canyon walls gradually lowering as they approached its eastern end. The vegetation changed as they went, becoming more sparse, the trees giving way to scrub, brush, and cactus as the elevation decreased. Finally, they emerged from the canyon onto a broad slope that led up to a ridgeline. From here, they would be visible to anyone watching the terrain, but there was no help for it. This was the route to Fort Apache. "Stay alert," Jed cautioned as they began the climb. "We're exposed here." Amara nodded, her gaze constantly scanning their surroundings, hand never far from her revolver. They climbed steadily, the horses picking their way carefully over the rocky terrain. The sun beat down relentlessly, its heat intensifying as the morning advanced. By midday, they had reached the ridgeline. Jed reined in his gelding at the crest, gazing out over the vast panorama that spread before them. In the distance, the San Carlos Mountains rose blue and hazy. Closer at hand, a broad valley stretched eastward, bisected by a river that gleamed like polished silver in the sunlight. "There," Jed said, pointing to a cluster of buildings nestled against the foothills on the far side of the valley. "Fort Apache." Amara shaded her eyes, studying the distant outpost with an expression that mingled hope and trepidation. "So close now," she murmured. Jed nodded, understanding the complex emotions that must be churning within her as they neared their destination. "We'll make camp in that stand of trees tonight," he said, indicating a small grove about halfway across the valley. "Reach the fort tomorrow morning." They began their descent into the valley, keeping to what cover was available, though both knew they were visible to anyone watching from a distance. The land here was more open, the desert scrub offering little concealment. They rode steadily, alert for any sign of other travelers or potential threats. The sun was beginning its westward slide when Jed spotted the dust cloud on the horizon behind them. He reined in sharply, Amara following suit, both turning to study the approaching riders. 4, maybe 5, Jed estimated, his experienced eye reading the signs. "Moving fast." Amara's expression hardened. "Red Wolf?" "Possibly," Jed acknowledged. "Or Army Patrol. Either way, we need to move." They spurred their horses into a canter, making for the small grove of trees Jed had identified as their campsite. It was still a good hour's ride away, and the approaching riders were moving faster, clearly intending to intercept them. "They'll catch us before we reach the trees," Amara observed, her voice calm despite the danger. Jed knew she was right. The open terrain offered no place to make a stand, no defensible position. "We split up," he decided quickly. "I'll draw them off. You keep going to the fort." Amara shook her head emphatically. "No, we stay together." "Amara," Jed began, but she cut him off. "If it is Red Wolf, he wants both of us," she said firmly. "Better to face them together than be hunted separately." Jed wanted to argue but recognized the practical wisdom in her assessment. Together they at least had a chance. Separated, they might both fall. The riders were close enough now that individual figures could be distinguished. 5 men riding hard, and at their head, the unmistakable figure of Red Wolf Sullivan. But it was the man beside him that sent a cold jolt through Jed's veins, taller, older, with the rigid posture of a career military man. Colonel Sullivan had indeed returned to the territory. "Your colonel is with them," Amara said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. "And mine," Jed said quietly. They exchanged a brief glance, an unspoken communication passing between them. Then, by mutual consent, they reined their horses to a stop and turned to face the approaching riders. If there was to be a confrontation, better to meet it head-on than to be run down from behind. The 5 horsemen slowed as they approached, spreading out in a loose semicircle about 20 yards away. Red Wolf's face was flushed with exertion and anticipation, a predatory grin spreading across his features. Beside him, Colonel Sullivan sat his horse with military precision, his weathered face impassive. his cold blue eyes assessing the situation with calculated efficiency. "Well, well," Red Wolf called, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "Told you we'd find them, Pa." Colonel Sullivan made no response to his son's gloating, his attention fixed on Jed with laser-like intensity. "Rollins," Sullivan said, his voice crisp and authoritative. "It's been a while." "Not long enough," Jed replied evenly. "Heard you retired." A thin smile crossed the colonel's face. "Temporarily, the Army still needs my expertise." Sullivan's gaze shifted to Amara, eyes narrowing with clinical detachment. "Apache, one of the troublesome bands, I presume?" Amara met his gaze unflinchingly, her posture proud despite facing the man who ordered her family's destruction. "She's under my protection," Jed stated. "We have business at Fort Apache." "What a coincidence," Sullivan remarked, false cordiality barely masking his threat. "Perhaps we should travel together." Jed's hand drifted toward his rifle. "We prefer our own pace." Red Wolf snorted, his patience with the verbal sparring clearly wearing thin. "Enough talk, Pa. Let's just take him. The Apache bitch is mine." Sullivan silenced his son with a sharp gesture, his attention never leaving Jed. "You always were the troublesome one, Rollins," he said conversationally. "Good scout, but too many principles. It's why I wasn't entirely surprised when you turned your weapon on your own comrades at that Apache village." Jed felt Amara's startled glance but kept his focus on Sullivan. "Those men were murdering women and children," he said, the old anger rising fresh within him. "That wasn't war. It was massacre." "It was necessary," Sullivan countered, his voice hardening. "Savages understand only one language: overwhelming force. Show weakness, and they exploit it. Show mercy, and they see it as opportunity." His gaze shifted to Amara again, cold and assessing, as this one proved when she allied herself with a traitor. Amara's voice when she spoke was remarkably steady, despite the emotions that must have been raging within her. "I know who you are," she said, each word precise and clear. "Colonel Sullivan, the butcher of San Carlos, the man who ordered the death of my family." If Sullivan was surprised by her direct accusation, he didn't show it. His expression remained impassive, his posture relaxed despite the tension humming in the air. "I've ordered the death of many hostiles over the years," he replied with casual indifference. "Part of the job. Nothing personal." "It was personal to me," Amara said, her voice lowering. "To my husband, to my infant son, to my mother and father." A flicker of recognition crossed Sullivan's face, quickly suppressed. "Ah, that village 5 years ago near the Gila River." He nodded slightly as if confirming a minor detail in a report. "A necessary operation. Your people had been raiding settlements, stealing cattle, killed a family of settlers near Tucson." "That is a lie," Amara said, her composure cracking slightly. "We lived peacefully, grew crops, hunted on our ancestral lands." Sullivan shrugged, dismissing her protest as irrelevant. "The report said otherwise." "Your reports," Jed interjected, "written to justify what you'd already decided to do." Sullivan's eyes hardened, the facade of civility slipping momentarily. "Careful, Rollins, you're already guilty of treason for your actions that day. Only my discretion kept you from a firing squad." "Your discretion," Jed repeated with bitter emphasis. "You mean your fear of what I might testify about what really happened if I faced a court-martial?" The colonel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign that Jed's words had struck home. Before he could respond, Red Wolf interrupted, his patience clearly exhausted. "Enough of this, Pa," he exclaimed, drawing his pistol. "Let's just shoot the traitor and take the woman." Sullivan raised a hand to restrain his impetuous son, but the tension had already escalated beyond his control. Jed's rifle was in his hands now, aimed squarely at Sullivan's chest. Beside him, Amar had drawn her revolver with impressive speed, covering Red Wolf with steady hands. The standoff hung in the balance, 5 against 2, but with the crucial advantage that Jed and Amar had their weapons already drawn and aimed at the 2 leaders of the opposing group. "Lower your weapon, boy," Jed said to Red Wolf, his voice deadly calm, "unless you want to watch your father die before you join him." Red Wolf's face contorted with rage, but uncertainty flashed in his eyes as he glanced at his father, seemingly held in Jed's sights. Sullivan, for his part, remained unnaturally calm, his hands resting on his saddle horn, making no move toward his own weapon. "Think carefully, Rawlins," he said quietly. "Kill me, and you'll never leave this territory alive." The Army takes a dim view of officers being murdered by former scouts with questionable loyalties. "And what about Apache women seeking justice for massacred families?" Amara asked, her revolver unwavering. "What view does your Army take of that?" Sullivan's cold gaze shifted to her. "The Army's view is that dead hostiles don't file complaints," he said bluntly. "But live ones can be re-educated, particularly young ones." A chill ran through Jed at the implication in Sullivan's words. Beside him, Amara had gone very still, her breathing shallow, her finger tightening almost imperceptibly on the trigger of her revolver. "What do you know of my sister's children?" she demanded, a tremor in her voice betraying her emotional control for the first time. Sullivan's thin smile returned, satisfaction evident in his expression as he recognized a vulnerability to exploit. "Ah, so that's why you're heading to Fort Apache. Looking for lost little ones, are we?" The cruel pleasure in his tone told Jed that Sullivan knew exactly what had happened to the children Amara sought, and that the knowledge was not going to bring her comfort. The standoff had reached a critical point, balance tipping toward violence with each passing second. Jed could feel it in the air, see it in the tense postures of the men facing them, hear it in the ragged breathing of Red Wolf as he struggled between fear and rage. One wrong move, one word, and blood would flow in this desolate valley, far from the justice Amara sought or the redemption Jed craved. And regardless of who survived, the outcome would likely be the same. More death, more loss, more tragedy piled atop the mountains already accumulated. In that moment of crystalline clarity, Jed made a decision that would alter the course of all their fates. A choice born not of calculation, but of instinct, not of reason, but of the deeper wisdom Amara had attributed to his warrior spirit. The part of him that knew right from wrong beyond what others might tell him. A choice that would carry them forward into the final chapter of their shared journey, for better or worse. "You're right, Sullivan," and he called, his voice steady despite the tension thrumming through his body. "Kill you and it ends here, but you might want to consider what happens after." The colonel's eyes narrowed slightly, his hand still resting casually on his saddle horn. "Enlighten me, he said, the words clipped and cold. Jed shifted slightly, keeping his rifle trained on Sullivan's chest, but allowing his gaze to sweep over the other riders. Red Wolf and three men who looked like hired guns rather than soldiers. Men who followed orders for pay, not loyalty. "I've kept a journal," Jed said, the lie coming smoothly, born of desperate necessity. Detailed account of what happened that day at the Apache village. Names, orders given, actions taken, everything. He paused, letting the implications sink in. "It's sealed with instructions to be opened if I don't return." Sullivan's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his cold blue eyes. Calculation, perhaps, or the first hint of uncertainty. "A convenient claim," he said dismissively. "Unprovable." "Maybe," Jed conceded. "But are you willing to risk it? Your new command, your reputation in Washington, all riding on whether I'm bluffing or not." Beside him, Amara remained silent, her revolver steady in her hand, understanding instinctively that this delicate negotiation required precision. Colonel Sullivan studied Jed for a long moment, his weathered face impossible to read. Then, with deliberate casualness, he turned to his son. "Stand down, Red Wolf," he ordered. "This isn't the time or place." Red Wolf's face contorted with frustrated rage. "Pa, you can't just let them." "I said stand down." Sullivan's voice cracked like a whip, the command absolute. Reluctantly, Red Wolf lowered his pistol, though his expression promised that this retreat was temporary at best. "A wise choice," Jed said, his own weapon remaining steady. "Now you and your men are going to turn around and ride back the way you came. Amara and I will continue to Fort Apache." Sullivan's thin smile held no warmth. "I think not," he said smoothly. "You see, Fort Apache is currently under my command. Special appointment from Washington. Temporary duty, sorting out the Apache problem in the territory." The revelation hit Jed like a physical blow. Sullivan in command at their destination changed everything. He glanced at Amara, seeing the same realization dawning in her eyes. "And as for your Apache friend's mission," Sullivan continued, clearly enjoying their dismay, "I'm afraid she'll be disappointed. The mission school children were transferred last month, part of the new policy centralizing education facilities at larger reservations. Amara's composure slipped momentarily, her breath catching. "You lie," she said, the words half accusation, half desperate hope. Sullivan shrugged indifferently. "Believe what you wish. The facts remain unchanged." Jed's mind raced, assessing their options in this radically altered situation. Sullivan in command at Fort Apache meant no sanctuary there, no hope of finding official help in locating Amara's sister's children. But was Sullivan telling the truth about the children being transferred? Or was it simply another tactic to unbalance them? "Here's what's going to happen," Sullivan said, his tone that of a man accustomed to dictating terms rather than negotiating them. "You will lower your weapons. You will accompany us to Fort Apache, where matters can be properly addressed." The implied threat hung in the air between them. Jed knew what properly addressed meant in Sullivan's lexicon, a bullet in the back for him, labeled as an attempted escape. And for Amara, he didn't want to contemplate what fate Sullivan might devise for her. "And if we refuse?" Jed asked, though he already knew the answer. Sullivan's cold smile widened fractionally. "Then we have a standoff which can only end one way. You might kill me, Rollins. You might even take my son with me. But my men will ensure neither of you leaves this valley alive." The brutal calculus was undeniable. Even if Jed and Amara emerged victorious from an immediate firefight, they would still be hunted across the territory, branded as murderers of a decorated army officer. In that moment, Jed made another decision, one born not of surrender, but of strategic retreat. "We'll come with you," he said, lowering his rifle slowly. "But I want your word that Amara will be treated according to proper military protocols for civilian detainees." Amara shot him a startled glance, clearly not having anticipated this concession, but Jed gave her a subtle look, silently urging her to trust him. Sullivan nodded, satisfaction evident in his bearing. Of course, the army is not barbaric, despite what some might claim. The irony in his words was deliberate, a private joke at the expense of his victims. "The woman will be accorded all appropriate treatment." With obvious reluctance, Amara lowered her revolver. One of Sullivan's men immediately rode forward to collect their weapons, handling them with the careful respect of someone who understood their value. "A wise decision," Sullivan said, gesturing for two of his men to position themselves on either side of Jed and Amara. "Now, shall we continue to Fort Apache? I believe we all have business there." As they rode eastward under escort, Jed glanced at Amara, finding her watching him with a mixture of confusion and wary trust. He couldn't explain his plan, not with Sullivan's men within earshot, but he tried to convey with his eyes that this apparent capitulation was not the end of their journey, merely a detour. Amara gave a nearly imperceptible nod, her chin lifting slightly in that gesture of quiet determination he had come to recognize. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, prisoners for now, but not defeated. The sun continued its westward arc as the small convoy moved through the valley, shadows lengthening across the arid landscape. Fort Apache grew larger on the horizon with each passing mile, its whitewashed walls and military precision both a destination and a new battlefield in their ongoing struggle. For Jed, the approaching fort represented a return to a world he had left behind. The rigid hierarchies of military life, the unquestioning obedience, the casual brutality masked as discipline. For Amara, it was both the potential location of her sister's children and the embodiment of the force that had destroyed her people. And for both of them, it was the next chapter in a story neither had anticipated when their paths crossed beside a desert stream just 2 days and a lifetime ago. Fort Apache rose from the valley floor like an artificial interruption in the natural landscape. All straight lines and right angles where the surrounding terrain flowed in organic curves. The whitewashed walls of the officers' quarters gleamed in the late afternoon sun, while the parade ground stretched flat and dusty at the center of the compound. A tall flagpole stood in precise center, the American flag hanging limp in the still air. As they approached the main gate, Jed noted the increased activity within, more soldiers than he remembered from his previous visits. Additional guard posts, a general air of heightened readiness. Sullivan's return had clearly brought changes to the formerly sleepy outpost. The sentries snapped to attention as they recognized the colonel, the gates swinging open without question or delay. Sullivan led the way inside, his posture becoming even more rigid now that he was on official territory, the mantle of command settling visibly upon his shoulders. Jed glanced at Amara, noting her carefully neutral expression as they entered the fort. Only the tightness around her eyes and the white-knuckle grip on her saddle horn betrayed her tension at being surrounded by the uniforms that represented so much pain in her history. The small procession halted in front of the headquarters building, a simple but imposing structure with a wide porch and the regimental colors displayed above the door. Sullivan dismounted with military precision, handing his reins to a waiting orderly. "Sergeant Hayes," he called to a weathered, non-commissioned officer who had emerged from the building, "escort our guests to the visitors' quarters. Post a guard. They are not to leave without my express permission." The sergeant saluted sharply. "Yes, sir. This way, please." Jed and Amara dismounted, both moving stiffly after the long ride. As Amara slid from Willow's back, Jed noted her subtle inspection of their surroundings, cataloging exits, guard positions, potential weapons, the survival instincts of a woman who had lived through a massacre. "Your horses will be tended to," the sergeant assured them, his tone professional but not unfriendly. "Please follow me." They were led across the parade ground toward a small detached building near the eastern wall of the fort. Jed recognized it as the quarters usually reserved for civilian scouts or visiting officials, basic but comfortable and, importantly, separate from both the enlisted barracks and officers' quarters. "Colonel Sullivan wishes to speak with you after evening mess," the sergeant informed them as he opened the door to reveal a simple room with two narrow beds, a washstand, and a small table with chairs. "I'll have food sent over. In the meantime, please remain here." The door closed behind him with a decisive click, followed by the sound of boots as a guard took up position outside. Alone for the first time since their surrender, Jed and Amara exchanged a look of cautious assessment. The room, while Spartan, was cleaner and more comfortable than many places they had slept in recent days, but the knowledge that they were effectively prisoners cast a shadow over even these modest accommodations. Amara moved to the single window, looking out at the fort's interior with careful scrutiny. "Many soldiers," she observed quietly. "More than usual." Jed nodded, joining her at the window. "Much more. Sullivan's building up forces for something." He hesitated, then added, "Probably an operation against the remaining free Apache bands." Amara's expression tightened, but she didn't appear surprised. "The Apache problem he mentioned," she said, the words bitter on her tongue. Jed ran a hand through his dust-covered hair, wincing as his fingers caught in tangles. "We need to find out if he was telling the truth about the mission school children being transferred." "And if he was?" Amara asked, the question hanging heavy between them. Jed met her gaze directly. "Then we find out where they were taken, and we go there next." A flash of something, surprise perhaps, or tentative hope, crossed Amara's face. "We," she repeated, the single word carrying a weight of question. "If you want," Jed said simply, "I made a promise to help you find your sister's children. Don't intend to break it just because Sullivan's thrown an obstacle in our path." Amara studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face for deception or uncertainty. Finding neither, she nodded once, a gesture of acceptance that somehow felt more significant than words could have been. The moment was interrupted by a knock at the door. Both tensed instinctively, but it was only an orderly with a tray of food: beans, cornbread, coffee, and surprisingly fresh apples. "Compliments of the colonel," the young soldier said, setting the tray on the small table. "He sends his regards and reminds you of your appointment after evening mess." When the door had closed behind him, Jed approached the food with caution. "Sullivan's being suspiciously accommodating," he murmured, examining the meal. "You think it might be poisoned?" Amara asked, her tone suggesting she wouldn't put it past the colonel. Jed shook his head. "Not Sullivan's style. Too subtle. When he wants someone dead, he makes sure they know who's killing them." He broke off a piece of cornbread and ate it. "No, this is something else. He's playing a game." "What kind of game?" Amar asked, reluctantly joining him at the table. Despite her suspicion, hunger won out after their long day's ride. Jed considered the question as he ate, turning over possibilities in his mind. "Sullivan's a strategist," he said finally, "always thinking several moves ahead. This," he gestured at their relatively comfortable accommodations and the decent food, "is part of a larger plan. We just need to figure out what." Blood Oath Part 6, Freedom and Reconciliation. A knock at the door interrupted their meal. Jed and Amara exchanged a quick glance before the door opened to reveal a young lieutenant. He was tall and lean, with intelligent eyes that darted nervously between them. "I'm Lieutenant Cooper," he said in a low voice, closing the door behind him. "I don't have much time." Jed studied the young officer, noting the nervous energy in his movements and the way he kept glancing toward the window. "What do you want, Lieutenant?" Jed asked, his tone neutral but guarded. Cooper took a deep breath. "I need to speak with you about Colonel Sullivan. There are irregularities in his command that have come to my attention." Amara rose from her chair, her posture alert. "What kind of irregularities?" "Reports falsified, orders given without proper authorization." Cooper's voice dropped even lower, including the operation 5 years ago at the Apache village near the Gila. Jed's eyes narrowed. "Why are you telling us this?" "Because I've seen what happens when good men stay silent." Cooper pulled a folded paper from inside his uniform jacket. "This is a copy of the transfer orders for the mission school children. They were sent to Mission St. Francis in Tucson, not to another reservation, as Sullivan claimed." Amara's breath caught, her hand reaching for the paper with barely controlled emotion. "Clara and Michael," she whispered, reading the names of her sister's children. "They are there." "Why help us?" Jed asked, still suspicious. Cooper met his gaze directly. "My father was a missionary who worked with the Apache. He taught me that they were people, not savages. What happened to that village wasn't war, it was murder. And it wasn't the only time." He moved to the window, peering out cautiously. "Sullivan's planning another operation, a final solution to the Apache bands still free in the mountains. He's gathered extra forces, waiting for reinforcements from Fort Grant." "When?" Jed asked, tension evident in his voice. 3 days, maybe 4. Cooper turned back to them. "I can help you escape tonight. There's a drainage tunnel under the eastern wall used to prevent flooding during the rainy season. It leads outside the fort perimeter." Amara studied the young officer's face. "Why risk your career? Your life?" A shadow crossed Cooper's features. "Because some things are worth more than following orders. I think Rollins understands that." Jed nodded, a silent acknowledgement passing between the men. "I'll come back after midnight," Cooper continued. "The sentry at the east wall will be occupied with a distraction. Be ready to move quickly." After Cooper left, Jed and Amara studied the paper he had given them. A military transport order with a list of Apache children being transferred from Fort Apache to Mission St. Francis in Tucson. Clara and Michael Swift, Arrow's names were clearly visible, along with their ages, 9 and 7. "They're alive," Amara whispered, her fingers tracing the names with reverent care. "And we'll find them," Jed affirmed. "But first, we need to get out of here." They spent the remaining hours preparing, gathering what meager supplies they could from their quarters, hiding them in their clothing. As night fell and the sounds of the fort quieted, they waited, tense but determined. True to his word, Cooper returned just after midnight. The young lieutenant was dressed in civilian clothes, carrying a bundle under his arm. "The East Sentry will be distracted for the next 15 minutes, he explained, handing them the bundle. "Civilian clothes. Change quickly." Jed and Amara hastily donned the plain clothing Cooper had brought, simple shirts, vests, and trousers that would help them blend in outside the fort. Cooper led them across the darkened parade ground, keeping to the shadows, avoiding the pools of light cast by the occasional lamp. The drainage tunnel was just where he had described, a stone-lined passage barely large enough for a person to crawl through, its entrance partially concealed by the scrub brush that had been allowed to grow against the outer wall. "What about you?" Jed asked as they prepared to enter the tunnel. Cooper shook his head. "I'm staying. Someone needs to delay Sullivan's operation, give the Apache bands time to move." "They'll court-martial you if they discover what you've done," Jed warned. The young lieutenant smiled grimly. "Then I'll make sure they don't discover it. Go now. There are horses waiting on the other side, courtesy of Sergeant Hayes. He doesn't agree with Sullivan either." Amara surprised them both by briefly clasping Cooper's hand. "May your ancestors watch over you, Lieutenant, and yours guide you to your family," he replied softly. One by one, they entered the tunnel, Amara first, then Jed. The passage was tight and damp, smelling of earth and mildew. They crawled forward on hands and knees, feeling their way through the darkness toward the distant circle of starlight that marked the exit. Emerging on the other side, they found themselves in a small gully several hundred yards from the fort. As promised, two horses waited, tethered to a stunted juniper tree. Simple trail horses, nothing fancy, but they looked strong and well-fed. They mounted quickly, Jed pausing only long enough to check that Cooper had included a basic map showing the route to Tucson. Then they were off, riding south and west, putting as much distance between themselves and Fort Apache as possible before dawn. "We need to warn the Apache bands in the mountains," Amara said as they rode, "about Sullivan's planned attack." Jed nodded grimly. "We'll send word once we reach the trading post at Cibecue Creek. Old Man Jenkins has contacts among the free bands." They rode through the night, the stars wheeling overhead, the only sounds the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the occasional call of a nightbird. By dawn, they had put nearly 20 miles between themselves and Fort Apache. They made camp in a sheltered arroyo, resting through the heat of the day before continuing their journey as the sun began to set. 4 days of hard riding brought them to the trading post at Cibecue Creek, where Jenkins, true to Jed's assessment, agreed to send runners to warn the mountain bands about Sullivan's impending operation. "Sullivan's overreached this time," the grizzled old trader told them as they shared a simple meal in his back room. "Word's already spreading about what he's planning. Got a telegram yesterday. Army inspector from Washington's on his way to investigate complaints about his command." "Will they believe it?" Amar asked skeptically. "The white man's justice has never favored my people." Jenkins shrugged his bony shoulders. "Times are changing, slow but sure. And Sullivan's made enemies in high places. Too eager with that final solution talk of his. Reminds folks too much of what happened with the Modoc a few years back. Army brass doesn't want another scandal." The next morning, rested and with fresh supplies, they continued toward Tucson. The journey took another 5 days, following the winding route that would keep them away from main trails and settlements where Sullivan might have men watching. As they rode, the subtle dynamic between them continued to shift and evolve. The shared hardship of the trail, the common purpose, and the growing understanding between them had transformed what began as hostility into something neither could yet name. Not quite trust, but perhaps the beginnings of it. On the 7th night after their escape, camped in the shelter of a sandstone outcropping, Amara finally asked the question that had been hovering between them. "What will you do after Tucson, after we find the children?" Jed poked at the small fire with a stick, watching the sparks rise into the night sky. He had been asking himself the same question. "Haven't thought that far ahead," he admitted. "Can't go back to the ranch. Sullivan will have men watching it. Maybe head to California or New Mexico territory." He looked up, meeting her gaze across the fire. "What about you and the children?" Amara's expression softened as she considered. "I had thought to take them back to the reservation at San Carlos, where some of our people still live. But now," she shook her head slowly, "Sullivan knows to look for us there." "You could come with me," Jed said, the words emerging before he could reconsider them. Amara's eyes widened slightly, surprise evident in her expression. "To California? Or wherever we decide." Jed held her gaze steadily. "The children would be safer if we stayed together. And there's land to be had in the West, far from Sullivan and his kind." Amara was silent for a long moment, the firelight playing across her features as she weighed his words. "We will see," she said finally, "after the mission." It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. Jed nodded, accepting the ambiguity. They still had a long road ahead, and much could happen before such decisions needed to be made. Tucson appeared on the horizon 3 days later, a sprawling settlement nestled against arid mountains. Unlike the raw frontier towns they had avoided on their journey, Tucson boasted brick buildings, established businesses, and the unmistakable influence of both Mexican and American cultures. They approached cautiously, aware that word of their escape might have reached even here. But the size of the town worked in their favor. 2 dusty travelers among many, unremarkable in the bustling streets. The Mission St. Francis stood on the town's eastern edge, a simple adobe structure with a modest bell tower, surrounded by various outbuildings that served as classrooms and dormitories for its young charges. A garden of herbs and vegetables grew along one wall, tended by children under the watchful eye of a black-robed sister. Jed and Amara observed from a distance, taking in the mission's routine, noting the times when the children emerged for lessons or chores. There were perhaps 30 children in all, ranging from 5 to 12 years old, all dressed in simple matching clothes. The boys in white shirts and dark trousers, the girls in plain dresses. How will we know which ones are Clara and Michael? Jed asked quietly. I will know, Amara replied, her eyes never leaving the children. They are my blood. They waited until evening, when the children would be gathered for supper in the mission's dining hall. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the dusty yard, they approached the mission's main entrance. An elderly sister answered Jed's knock, her weathered face curious, but not unwelcoming. May I help you? Jed removed his hat respectfully. We're looking for Mother Superior. It's about two of the children recently transferred from Fort Apache. The sister studied them for a moment, then nodded. Wait here, please. She returned shortly with an older woman whose erect posture and direct gaze spoke of both authority and compassion. I am Mother Agatha, she said. Sister Bernadette tells me you're inquiring about children from Fort Apache. Yes, ma'am, Jed replied. This is Amara Swift Arrow. She's looking for her sister's children, Clara and Michael. The Mother Superior's eyes sharpened as she looked more closely at Amara. Are you indeed? She turned to Sister Bernadette. Please bring Clara and Michael to my study. They followed Mother Agatha through cool, whitewashed corridors to a small office furnished with a simple desk and chairs. The walls were adorned with a crucifix and several religious paintings, the only ornamentation in an otherwise austere room. The children arrived 6 weeks ago, Mother Agatha explained, taking a seat behind her desk. They were among a group transferred from Fort Apache under military escort. The officer in charge informed us their parents were deceased. Their mother was my sister, Amara said. She died 2 winters ago. I have been searching for them since. Mother Agatha nodded thoughtfully. I see. And you, sir, what is your interest in this matter? I'm helping Miss Swift Arrow reunite with her family, Jed replied simply. Mother Agatha's gaze was penetrating, but not unkind. These children have suffered much disruption in their young lives. I must be certain that leaving with you would be in their best interest. Before Amara could respond, a soft knock interrupted them. Sister Bernadette entered, leading 2 children, a girl with solemn eyes and long black hair tied back in a neat braid, and a younger boy who half hid behind his sister, watching the strangers warily. Amara's breath caught as she saw them. She rose slowly, her eyes never leaving the children's faces. Clara, she said softly in Apache. Michael, do you remember me? Your mother's sister, Amara? The children stared at her, confusion evident in their expressions. The girl, Clara, frowned slightly, studying Amara's face. We're not supposed to speak Apache here, she said in careful school-taught English. Sister Mary Joseph says it's the devil's tongue. A flash of pain crossed Amara's face, quickly suppressed. I understand, she replied in English. But do you remember me, Clara? I used to sing to you when you were small. Your mother and I would gather herbs in the hills, and you would come with us. Clara tilted her head, a faint recognition dawning in her eyes. You made me a doll, with corn husk hair. Amara nodded, a tremulous smile touching her lips. Yes, and I taught you a song. Do you remember? Hesitantly, Clara hummed a few notes of an Apache lullaby. Michael peered around his sister, his curiosity overcoming his shyness. You know our real mother? He asked. Not the one in heaven? Yes, little one, Amara said gently. Your mother was my sister. She asked me to find you before she went to join the ancestors. Mother Agatha watched this exchange with thoughtful eyes, her hands folded in her lap. The children have adapted well to life here, she said. They are learning to read and write. They attend daily mass. And I am grateful for your care of them, Amara replied, looking directly at the older woman. But they belong with their people, with family who loves them. The nun studied her for a long moment. You are aware that taking them from here will not be easy? There will be paperwork, questions. The Indian agent will need to be consulted. Ma'am, Jed interjected respectfully, there are complications. The officer who arranged their transfer, Colonel Sullivan, has personal reasons for not wanting Miss Swift Arrow to find these children. He has already misled her about their whereabouts and attempted to prevent this reunion. Mother Agatha's eyebrows rose slightly. I see. And what would you propose? Jed hesitated, knowing what he was about to suggest could be interpreted as kidnapping. We were hoping to take them now, tonight, before word can reach Sullivan that we're here. The Mother Superior was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she surprised them both. Sister Bernadette, please help the children gather their belongings. They will be leaving with their aunt. The younger nun's eyes widened, but she nodded and led the children from the room. You realize I could be removed from my position for this, Mother Agatha said once they were alone again. Why help us then? Amara asked. The older woman's eyes grew distant, remembering. I served at a mission in the Dakota Territory during the troubles there. I saw what happens when the army decides what is best for the Indian. I will not be party to it again. She focused on Amara. These children need their culture, their heritage, something we cannot give them here, despite our best intentions. Sister Bernadette returned with Clara and Michael, each carrying a small bundle of possessions. The children looked uncertain but excited, stealing glances at Amara as if still trying to convince themselves she was real. Mother Agatha rose. Go with God's blessing, she said. There is a trail behind the mission that leads south, away from the main roads. I suggest you use it. As they prepared to leave, she pressed a small leather pouch into Amara's hand. For your journey. It isn't much, but it may help. Amara opened it to find a modest sum of money and a small silver cross. I cannot. Please, the nun interrupted. For the children. Outside, night had fallen completely, the mission courtyard lit only by stars and a sliver of moon. They moved quickly to where their horses waited, Jed lifting Michael onto his saddle before mounting behind him. Clara rode with Amara, her small arms wrapped tightly around her aunt's waist. They followed the trail Mother Agatha had suggested, riding south through the desert night, putting miles between themselves and Tucson before making camp in the shelter of a small canyon. The children, exhausted by the day's events, fell asleep almost immediately, wrapped in blankets near the small fire Jed had built. Amara watched them sleep, her expression a mixture of joy and concern. They have forgotten so much, she said softly. Their language, their customs, the songs their mother sang. Jed sat beside her, keeping his voice low to avoid waking the children. They'll remember, or learn again. They're young, and they have you now. Where will we go? She asked, echoing their earlier conversation. Sullivan will not stop looking for us. Jed was silent for a moment, thinking. I have a friend, a former scout who settled near the Colorado border. Has a ranch in a hidden valley the Army never mapped. We could stay there while we figure out what comes next. And Sullivan? Sooner or later he'll overreach, Jed replied. Men like him always do. Jenkins was right. The tide is turning against his kind of solution to the Apache question. Amara's hand went to the pouch at her neck, where she kept the talismans of her blood oath. I have carried his name for 5 years, waiting for justice. Sometimes justice comes in ways we don't expect, Jed observed. Losing his command, his reputation, for a man like Sullivan, that might be a harder punishment than death. Amara considered this, watching the firelight play across the faces of her sleeping niece and nephew. Perhaps, she conceded, but the blood oath remains until it is fulfilled. They traveled north and west over the following days, keeping to little-used trails and remote canyons. The children gradually became more comfortable, asking questions about their mother, about the Apache way of life, about where they were going. Clara remembered more than Michael, fragments of language, snippets of songs, the shape and smell of her mother's cooking fire. A week into their journey, while camped beside a small spring in the shadow of the Catalina Mountains, they received unexpected news. A Pima trader, stopping to water his mules, shared the latest gossip from Tucson. Army officer arrested, he told them, as they shared coffee around the morning fire. Big scandal. Colonel accused of falsifying reports, conducting unauthorized operations, misappropriating military resources. What colonel? Jed asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Sullivan, I think they said. Garrison commander from Fort Apache. The trader shrugged, unconcerned with the details. Some lieutenant blew the whistle on him. Had documents, witnesses. They say he's been shipped back to Washington for court-martial. After the trader departed, Jed and Amara exchanged a meaningful glance. Lieutenant Cooper, Jed said. He must have found more evidence, or created an opportunity to use what he already had, Amara suggested. Whatever the case, the news changed their situation dramatically. With Sullivan removed from command and facing military justice, the immediate threat to their safety diminished. They could travel more openly now, perhaps even consider settling somewhere more accessible than the remote hideaway Jed had proposed. 3 weeks after leaving Tucson, they arrived at a small town near the Colorado border where Jed's friend, a former scout named Thomas Blackwood, owned the general store. Blackwood greeted them warmly, offering his home while they decided on their next steps. Land office in town, he mentioned casually over supper that first night. Got a nice parcel available about 10 miles west of here. Good water, decent soil, not too far from town, but private enough. Jed caught Amara's eye across the table. Might be worth looking into. The next day, they rode out to see the land Blackwood had mentioned, a small valley sheltered by low hills, with a clear creek running through it and enough flat ground for a modest ranch. Wild horses grazed in the distance, and a family of deer bounded away as they approached. Good hunting, Jed observed. Plenty of water. Could run a few cattle, maybe some horses. Amara watched Clara and Michael exploring the creek bank, their excited voices carrying in the clear air. The children would be safe here, room to grow. They returned to town and visited the land office, where Jed signed the preliminary paperwork using money they had saved from their journey and the small sum Mother Agatha had given them. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a place to build something new. That night, as the children slept in Blackwood's spare room, Amara and Jed sat on the porch of his home, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. I received a telegram today, Jed said quietly, from Jenkins. Sullivan's been formally charged. The evidence was overwhelming once Cooper came forward. He won't be returning to the territory. Amara absorbed this news in silence. Then, with deliberate movements, she removed the leather pouch from around her neck. From it, she withdrew the 2 pieces of buckskin, one bearing Sullivan's name, the other Jed's. Rising, she walked to the small fire burning in the yard, where Blackwood had been cooking earlier. Jed followed, watching as she knelt beside the flames. A blood oath can only be ended when justice is done, she said, her voice carrying the weight of ritual. Raymond Sullivan ordered the death of my family, my husband, my son. He has now faced the justice of his own people, stripped of rank and honor, his crimes exposed to the world. She placed the talisman bearing Sullivan's name into the fire, watching as the buckskin curled and blackened, then burst into brief, intense flame. It is finished, she said simply. Jed watched the talisman burn to ash, aware of the significance of this moment, the completion of a promise, the release of a burden carried for 5 years. And the other, he asked, nodding toward the second talisman she still held. Amara looked down at the piece of buckskin bearing Jed's name, her expression thoughtful. This one, she said slowly, is transformed. No longer a mark of vengeance, but a reminder of a different path, of choices made and unmade. She returned it to the leather pouch, then, in a gesture that surprised him, held the pouch out to him. Keep it, she said, as a promise of what we will build, not what we will destroy. Jed accepted the pouch, understanding the profound trust being offered. Together, he said, the word both a question and an affirmation. Together, Amara agreed, her eyes reflecting the starlight, for Clara and Michael, and for ourselves. The following spring found them settled on their new land. A cabin had been raised with the help of neighbors, including Blackwood and several local settlers who welcomed the addition to their small community. A corral held a few horses, including Willow, who had been recovered from Fort Apache after Sullivan's arrest. A modest garden grew alongside the cabin, tended by Amara and the children. Clara and Michael thrived in their new home, gradually recovering the language and customs of their heritage while adapting to their new life. Clara, now 10, proved to have her mother's gift for healing, eagerly learning about medicinal plants from Amara. Michael, 8, followed Jed everywhere, soaking up knowledge about horses, hunting, and the ways of the land. One evening, as the sun set over their small valley, Jed found Amara sitting outside the cabin, watching the children play with a litter of puppies born to their newly acquired dog. Letter came from Lieutenant Cooper, he said, settling beside her. He's been reassigned to Fort Laramie. Says the new commander at Fort Apache is making changes, working with the reservation leaders instead of against them. Amara nodded, a small smile touching her lips. The world turns, slowly but surely. That it does. Jed reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, holding it out to her. It was a ring, simple but beautifully crafted, a band of silver inlaid with turquoise. Blackwood's wife helped me find it, he explained. It's Apache made. Thought it fitting. Amara took the ring, her eyes widening as she understood its meaning. Are you certain? She asked. After everything? Because of everything, Jed corrected gently. What we've been through, what we've learned, who we've become together. Amara studied the ring, turning it to catch the last rays of sunlight. My people have different customs for such things, she said. No rings, but a blanket shared under the stars, with family as witness. Then we'll do both, Jed replied. Your traditions and mine. A new beginning, drawing from both our paths. Amara slipped the ring onto her finger, then reached for his hand. Together they watched as Clara showed Michael how to gently handle the puppies, her voice carrying clearly in the evening air as she taught him an Apache word for each color of their fur. From blood oath to blood bond, Amara said softly. The spirits work in strange ways. That they do, Jed agreed, his fingers intertwining with hers. That they do. In the distance, the wild horses grazed peacefully as shadows lengthened across the valley that was now their home. Not the end Amara had sought when she began her journey of vengeance, but perhaps the justice she had truly needed. Not death, but life, not destruction, but creation, not the settling of old debts, but the promise of a new beginning. The blood oath was fulfilled, its purpose transformed just as they had been transformed by the path they had traveled together. From enemies bound by a shared tragedy to partners united in hope, building something neither could have imagined when their paths first crossed beside a desert stream.